When I joined Accenture 4 years ago, I was welcomed by one of the best communities I've ever been in. I met amazing people who later on became my friends and whom I know I can always count on for both professional and moral support. In Accenture, we all work at the heart of change, and when we match our ingenuity with the latest technologies, we make incredible things. Being part of this team, you can always choose to change the project or technology, so you can either test your skills on a more challenging project or learn new technologies altogether. Here, it's all about what and who you want to be.
We have a core purpose statement. What we articulate internally is why do we exist? And that is that we exist to create an environment and a culture that breeds success by, number one, enabling our people to be the best that they can be, and number two, caring for our clients as individuals. So it's all about people.
It's all about people. Right at the core, it's our people.
I'm most proud of our people.
It's about the people who work within Endava. It's about the people we work for. And that underpins everything that we do and drives the culture, team-like behavior, the way we work with clients, from proof of concept, prototype to production.
Pe 22 și 23 octombrie, Agile Hub te invită la Peak IT 004.
I joined Accenture 4 years ago, I was welcomed by one of the best communities I've ever been in. I've met amazing people who later on became my friends and whom I know I can always count on for both professional and moral support. In Accenture, we all work at the heart of change, and when we match our ingenuity with the latest technologies, we make incredible things. Being part of this team, you can always choose to change the project or technology, so you can either test your skills on a more challenging project or learn new technologies altogether. Here, it's all about what and who you want to be.
Doamnelor și domnilor, bine ați venit la Peak IT 004. Gazda dumneavoastră, Marian Andrei.
Salutare tuturor, sper că atelierele v-au fost de folos. Mergem mai departe acum cu keynote speakerii și primul din următorii din seria de 3 este John Miles și acum o să trec în engleză ca să audă și el prezentarea. John is based in the UK and is the EU Engineering Director for Trimble MEP, a global organization that enjoys a large presence in Brașov. John has more than 20 years of experience studying and working in software engineering, coding desktop and cloud applications, and leading global DevOps and delivery teams. John, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Hey, how are you?
Can you hear me? I'm good, thank you.
Just give us a little bit of a sneak peek about what you're going to talk in the next 45-50 minutes.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm going to talk about cloud platforms, essentially. The importance kind of today about creating a cloud platform. So anyone that's kind of producing software, and these days it's generally on the cloud, people think about the products that they produce. I'm going to talk more about the platform that often underpins those products and why it's important to focus on that, with some aspects of some of the architectural things that we might want to think about when developing a platform, and then some of the organizational things we want to think about too.
Okay, so if you're ready, we are ready. You can start your presentation.
Great, thank you. Let me just get my screen shared. Hold on 1 second.
Yes.
I'm not sure I can share my screen. It says attendee screen sharing is disabled.
Okay, let's see.
Yep, 1 second. Yeah, you should be able to share it now. You're a co-host.
Yeah, great.
So.
Thanks. There we go. That looks more promising. Okay, and hopefully that's visible.
Yeah,
now.
it works. It works.
Excellent. So yes, I can get started then. Well, thanks for the introduction. I'm pretty excited to be here, actually. It'd be obviously better if I could be there over in Romania in person, because it's been almost 2 years, I think, since I've been able to get over there, and I miss coming over. But yeah, as mentioned, I'm John, and I work for Trimble in the MEP division, and that's mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. So it's kind of part of a construction area. So just a kind of vague idea of the sort of area that I work in. And as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about some key concepts that I've seen like in use at Trimble and elsewhere, that let you take on some pretty like major challenges with the products and the kind of functions that you provide to your customers and your users. And in particular, as I said, the software platform, cloud-based software platforms, and why it's important to focus on the platform itself. So a bit on the agenda so you can see what's coming. I'm going to talk about what the platform is, at least in my definition of it. I'm going to talk about the architectural concepts I mentioned, and then some of the organizational things as well. Okay, let me move on to the next one. So thinking about the definition of a platform, I think it's in most presentations, it's always a good place to start, kind of some sort of definition. And if you work in software engineering or study it, which I'm going to guess pretty much everyone here does, you probably hear the word platform multiple times a day, especially at the moment. And it can mean different things in different contexts and kind of different things to different people. And generally, they're all valid definitions of it. So I want to spend a bit of time explaining how I'm using it in this talk. So a good place to start is always Googling the definition for something. So that returns you, I think from Oxford Languages, a raised level surface on which people or things can stand. And we're not talking about people, so let's kind of shorten that a little bit, as a surface on which things can stand. And it's very generic, obviously, but actually it's a pretty good definition to start with. But to go a bit further in terms of technology, I'll talk a little bit about how it's used, how that term's used in the technology area, and some of the things that can be called platforms and are called platforms. Hopefully pull out of all of that exactly what I mean when I talk about it. So the first one to come to is probably YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, those kind of things that are called widely as platforms. And they're mostly platforms in the sense that they provide a technology on which others can distribute content. So in a lot of senses, the product that they provide is the platform. And that's, a platform, as YouTube is, for distributing your own videos or things like that. There's a lot of debate, is Facebook a publisher or a platform? But that's not exactly the sense of the word that I'm talking about. But you can be sure that those companies are definitely developing platforms as I'm talking about them to create their product. And then you've got things like Salesforce, Autodesk have Revit and AutoCAD. We have SketchUp and Tekla within Trimble, and their products, some web, some desktop, and they have a core product functionality within the domain that they operate. But they also allow extension points, usually through some kind of API or plugin architecture. And that allows others to build functionality that runs inside the product. So they're kind of products with platform components. And some of them have been around for many years, so it isn't a new concept. And again, it's not entirely what I'm talking about, but that sort of idea of extensibility is something that a software cloud platform actually really allows you to do. So there's certainly related elements and concepts there. And then, you can't really talk about the cloud without talking about, Google Cloud Platform, Azure, AWS. I think everyone's familiar with those. And they're cloud platforms that provide many different services to allow like hosting your own applications, services, websites, and so on. And they provide base functionality like data storage, messaging, routing, and many more things besides that. And then similarly, you've got things like Kafka, which is an event streaming platform, or Datadog, which is called a monitoring and alerting platform, more specific technology things. And they, again, there's a lot of platform concepts in those offerings, but the type of platform I'm talking about normally uses those as infrastructure components and has something a little bit more domain specific on top of it. So to start describing how I'm looking at the term platform, I'll introduce the star of my definition of it, which is some kind of domain API or a domain service, think of it as well. And it's an API that provides some kind of specific function within the domain that your platform exists. So if that sounds like a confusing description, then as an example, you could think of it as a shopping cart service in a retail domain. It's a particular function in that domain, or a booking service in a hotel domain, could be another one. And I'll talk about, as I get into the architecture side of things, microservices architecture. But essentially, you could think of these as microservices. And these provide all some kind of interface that exposes useful functionality to other consumers, which could be the other services or some kind of UI component. And that interface could be maybe a REST API or something else. Then you've got what I'd call core APIs or services. And these could be ones that you write, or you take something that's already provided as a service from somewhere else. And these don't really handle your domain. They're kind of base requirements of workflows like authentication or authorization, or user licensing, that kind of thing. So they're similar to domain services, perhaps in how they're constructed, but they're kind of a different thing that you might consider, especially as they can often be third-party things that you consume. So it's worth calling those out. And then the services need to work together generally, like each one providing something fairly narrow, some piece of functionality that's useful. But to create really something that your users want to see, it's going to be a workflow that spans multiple ones of them. So maybe they communicate through HTTP or through messaging, something like RabbitMQ maybe, or you might have an event stream like Kafka that sits in the middle of it all. Something that's providing ways of them talking to each other, and it might actually be a mix of those things too. And then your services need somewhere to live. They need to execute somewhere in the cloud. You want them to scale and be resilient. So it could be that they run as a serverless function, an AWS Lambda or an Azure function, like those ones towards the bottom. Or perhaps they're .NET Core Web APIs and they run inside Docker containers in Kubernetes. Like those infrastructure components, Kubernetes, the Azure and AWS functions, they're kind of key things you need to think about as you think about your platform, like how is it going to be delivered? And that's actually some significant work in building out those kind of pieces as well. And then data. Data is actually a really central piece to the platform. So you're going to have to think about data storage. You could have attached to your services like a Redis cache, Mongo databases, could be items in blob storage. They'll all be part of the picture. And as is logging and monitoring, those kind of base functions need to be considered as part of your platform as well, because they're integral to being able to run a platform in production. So you kind of think of those infrastructure components, the Kubernetes infrastructure, the logging monitoring is kind of the base layer of your platform. And this really kind of builds up the picture of what I see when I'm kind of talking about a platform. And the platform by itself isn't really the goal. Obviously, the goal is to provide useful functions to people. And that depends on your domain almost entirely, doesn't it? So if you think about Amazon, think about Amazon, the retail company, rather than Amazon, the AWS provider, and the kind of goals of that side of the business. I think Amazon's always a good example because it's so familiar to everyone. You've probably used it yourself, so you've got some idea of the sort of workloads of buying things and stuff like that. So their goal, I would say, and it's my interpretation of it, is broadly to allow consumers to find, purchase, maybe rent things, be it a physical item that you buy and is delivered to you, fulfilled, or you're renting a video that you're streaming, or subscribing to a music service, that kind of thing. Lets people buy those, have them delivered. Also lets different sellers, it has a marketplace that they can sell things directly to consumers that get fulfilled by Amazon. That's the goals of Amazon, of the things that it does. So that any platform that they would have supports that goal. And there are different, as you kind of think through all of those different things, there's different applications or products that you might consider on Amazon, kind of different discrete things. Some you'll see as a consumer, some you won't. So you've got like the website itself, and that's got loads of different components to it. You can order things through it. You can check the status of your orders, your deliveries, you get recommendations, that kind of thing. And you've got like the Prime Video app on your phone, your Fire TV, your Fire Stick, that kind of thing. And you can buy content through that, or you can access the content that you've already purchased through the Amazon website. And then you've got Alexa devices. You'd think of that as certainly as a discrete product. It has lots of functionality on it, but you can play your music. It can tell you when your delivery of something you've bought off Amazon is going to arrive. And then Amazon have their own internal systems for managing, the warehouses, the stock, the delivery processes itself. Very intelligent systems as well. And they've got all of these different things, and they all link up together. So you order something today on the Amazon website, and then tomorrow morning your Alexa device is going to ping and tell you that it's going to get delivered. It gets shipped out. You can track the delivery to a degree. it gets delivered to you today. Your Amazon app on your phone tells you that the status is delivered. There's a whole like flow of things that have happened there, from you purchasing it to you getting it. And underpinning all of that is a platform of services and components that all work rather seamlessly together and expose data and functionality through these kind of various faces that the apps that you either use visually or through Alexa as well. And the interfaces are all nice, they're all pretty good, they let you do what you need to do, they'll play their part in it. But the power, really, the thing that's tying everything together and that whole workflow and makes it succeed is the platform behind it. And it may be a legend, but supposedly Jeff Bezos famously said nearly 20 years ago, I think it was 2002, everything has to be an API. He had this mandate, they call it the API mandate. There's essentially everything that is developed from now on at Amazon has to have an interface. That's the only way of accessing its data. You can't share data any other way, on pain of being fired. I think it was that strong. Now, I imagine their approach has evolved somewhat, but that kind of shows the thinking that and the place Amazon were at as they were developing this platform, how they saw platforms. So I think once you get a platform in place, or you start to put it in place, it starts to give up new opportunities to link services together, to create new experiences, and pretty quickly as well sometimes. So you can start to build as many applications as you need, as many views on the platform as you need, using those same platform components perhaps, and very crucially the same data, and tying them together in new ways that's even ways that you haven't even thought about when you started on your platform. You think about how Alexa's slotted into that whole workflow. That wasn't there at the start 20 years ago. The notion of these components using the same data, which is pretty powerful as well, because you can start to think of new ways of using that data, analyzing it. Data analytics, something that actually event streaming can really help facilitate, is increasingly important to people. And you can expose the platform to others as well. So you can let third parties build off your platform. And potentially there, you're opening up new revenue streams for yourself. That's kind of like I was saying with the products that have a platform aspect to them, extensibility. And that's the value I've seen at Trimble, for example, in the domains that it operates in, and there are many, construction just being one of them. And if you think about that, think about what's involved in one of those kind of projects. You've got all these different actors, roles, and companies involved in it. It's like taking a project from its conception all the way through to completion, through design, detailing, estimation, that kind of thing. All these people involved in it. Or in the Amazon example, the process going from a customer placing an order to the delivery driver delivering it. All these other people will be working on it, and components interacting all the way through that, all interacting with the same set of data, workflows between them and across them. And if you focus on that platform that enables it, it really gives you the kind of capability to transform the way industries work, the way that Amazon have, and Trimble do as well. So hopefully that gives a good overview of what I would consider a platform, and what I mean as I'm talking about it now. And why I think it's important to focus the efforts, even above focusing on the individual product offerings that you often think about being like the end goal of the company. You focus instead mainly on the platform that enables those. It is, as I said at the very start, the surface on which all of those features and workflows will stand, regardless of how you deliver them. So paying attention to that service first enables you to create more joined up and innovative features and deliver them faster as well. So I'll start to talk about platform architecture. A couple of key concepts I want to talk about with this, and it's very, very much an introduction, an overview to them, because each of these could really be a whole, and it is a whole series of talks in their own rights. But what I want to do is give a kind of flavor for them, maybe promote some ideas and some thinking, that kind of thing. And the first pattern that I'll talk about is microservices. I've already mentioned it slightly, and I suspect it's fairly well known. So perhaps a deep dive isn't really what we need at this point. But to talk about microservices, it's useful to start maybe a little bit before microservices. And a traditional development approach, certainly the approach that I experienced when I started my career in application development and continue to use for many years, is what's now often described as a monolith. And in a monolith, you're creating a single solution that could contain many projects, many libraries, modules or DLLs, and whatever's appropriate. It might be structured like this in a kind of n-tiered architecture. You're dividing your business logic, your presentation, data access, and so on. And there are pretty effective ways of structuring and managing such an application. But the primary characteristic of a monolith is typically that it's kind of compiled, distributed, deployed, whatever, as one overall application. There are nuances to that when you think about kind of web applications that are developed as monoliths, but that's broadly a good enough description, I think. But where microservices differ, the contrast really is they break up the functionality of the system along functional domain boundaries to start to create smaller, individually developed, and very critically, individually deployable services, each providing a very specific domain function exposed through an interface, kind of there's that like box wrapping around them. And as they're individually developed and deployed, and as they communicate through these interfaces, you have a better degree of flexibility in what they look like. So the internals of each service don't matter to the other services one tiny bit. They can be structured however makes sense for their specific function, as long as you've got the compatibility through the interfaces. So you can make different technology choices between your services as well. So you can choose the technology that fits any of those individual services depending on its needs. And you can have a pretty diverse mix of technologies within the platform. Now, if you've been around a little while, it feels conceptually similar to another approach, which is service-oriented architecture. And you can probably consider as a precursor to microservices. And in that approach, you see the development of individual services in a similar way, discrete pieces of functionality. But by contrast, these are typically stitched together using an enterprise service bus. And that holds a lot of responsibility for orchestrating the interaction between the services and your applications, transforming data as well. And what sets microservices apart, and this is another important concept with microservices, is what Martin Fowler, the kind of design patterns guru, describes as smart endpoints and dumb pipes. So the enterprise service bus you can consider as a smart pipe because it has a lot of logic built into it and a lot of intelligence in that piece in the middle, outside of the services. Whereas microservices, they're the pieces that contain the intelligence and the logic, and they own their own data. So they're smart endpoints. And then unlike the enterprise service bus, there's no central intelligent controller that's programmed to control the services. Instead, they're communicating to each other through maybe the REST HTTP protocol or a messaging or eventing system, which I'll come to later. But it's the services themselves that largely orchestrate themselves. And you can look at it another way as well, that they choreograph rather than orchestrate. So they each know, their piece and what they need to do. And there's nothing telling each one what it should be doing. Visually, the event picture that's on the right looks similar in layout to the service-oriented architecture because you've got that kind of thing running through the middle of it. But I think the key point there, the difference is that in an eventing or messaging system in this case, it's not making decisions. It's just supplying the messages, supplying the data, supplying the communication. The decisions are still made. The logic is still all embedded into those services. And the picture that I painted, like in part here, and as I talked about my definition of the platform, is very much obviously microservices architecture. You've got your domain services and your core services. They're all wrapped up functionality into some kind of API that's exposed, some kind of interface. And then they can be used by consumers like your applications and your other services. You can see, I think, hopefully, there are some cons probably to a microservice architecture. And one of those is going to be complexity. You see, in the picture that I had before, it's, there aren't many services, but when you get to enterprise level platforms, you're kind of scaling out to hundreds of services. To put them all on one page like that, and you can Google large microservice architecture diagrams and you'll find spaghetti. So you really have to think about that as you decide whether or not microservices are appropriate for your organization, I suppose. Because you're creating a distributed system, and distributed systems get complex. Complexity comes in terms of communication. So communication between the services, but also between the teams that are developing them. And there's a very often used law, Conway's law, that kind of states that your organization is, I don't know if doomed's the right word, but maybe fated to create some kind of system that follows the same communication structure as the organization itself. So you need to kind of pay particular attention when you're working with platforms to your own internal communication strategy. But there's also latency, multiple points of failure in that kind of system. Infrastructure management overhead as well can be huge depending on how you're doing it. All things that are factors. But what's a real benefit, I see, and there are a number of benefits, but scalability is probably the thing I'd really call out there. And that's in a couple of senses. You've got runtime scalability, scaling up individual services as opposed to the whole system can be more rapid. Generally, your services are stateless, meaning that the actual executing service isn't holding any state between requests. You probably have a data store behind it, but you can have multiple services or instances of the same service, I should say, talking to that same data store. So a client can make a request that a load balancer handles and then sends to any one of those instances, and each of them would respond in exactly the same way. So you can easily have multiple instances running. And generally, they're pretty small. I mean, that's the micro and microservices. How small depends on you and your use cases, but typically they can be very quick to create and destroy them. That really depends on the technology. Using containers, maybe Windows containers typically take longer to start up than a Linux container. But the startup time in general is fairly small. So you can scale up and down based on demand, which could be looking at the current CPU or memory usage of your instances and scaling up if it's getting high, or looking at the number of messages in a queue that they're working off. You can also, as I mentioned about technology, you've got flexibility there. So maybe you've got a particular service or function that does some more intermittent processing tasks. So you've got spikes of activity where sometimes there's a huge amount that needs to be done, but a lot of the time there's zero usage. So you might make a serverless function for that particular thing, because that lets you scale it and execute it only when it's needed. And cost is an implication there. But other parts of your platform might have more consistent usage, and you have them as like Docker containers in Kubernetes. But as well as that kind of runtime scalability, there's also the scalability of your development itself. If you're thinking about autonomous microservices and you're decoupling them in good ways, then your teams that work on them can work fairly autonomously as well. And it can support much larger development organizations collaborating. And there's definitely things that you need to do to allow that. And some of that I'll talk a little bit about shortly towards the end of the talk. So that's kind of microservices. Obviously, there's some overhead to doing them. So if you're considering platforms, you would think carefully about it. But to me, it kind of, and I think to a lot of people, it seems like the go-to approach, really. But as I said, there are challenges with it, communication being one. So I want to look at one of the ways of approaching that kind of challenge, which is event-driven architecture. And that can actually then help sort of power up your platform as well. So yeah, when we first started creating platforms and microservices, the primary communication kind of default for us was REST between services. And actually, it still is one of the main interfaces that our services provide. makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people do use it as well for that reason, because it is very easy to reason with a request response mechanism. So your customer buys something in their shopping cart and you make a call to the order service and post a new order. Maybe then the order service calls another service to do some kind of, stock backend stuff or picking lists for the warehouse, that kind of thing. I mean, these examples are fairly trivial and probably not that real world, but hopefully they'll help illustrate the concepts. You've separated out responsibility along the microservices lines into those different services that own their piece of the puzzle, which is great. You've got your smart endpoints and you're using HTTP protocol and REST as your dumb pipe. But what you can also see in this picture with the lines going from one to the other, that there are dependencies there. There's point-to-point dependencies between services on the platform. And they're coupled. They're not coupled in the way that things are in a monolith, but they're coupled to a degree. And that's something that you might want to avoid. You don't want to create a situation where a change in one area has an impact on other areas. You don't want to get changed, so you actually have to deploy everything at once anyway. So you've probably got a distributed monolith. You've got small services, but they're too coupled. Now that's by no means inevitable with REST communication between services, but it's just kind of one of those things you really have to think about. And one way of thinking about it is changing how your services communicate in these workflows and moving towards a more event-driven approach, which can open up some other opportunities actually as well about how you extend your platform and how you think about data. So in an event-driven approach, you're elevating the things that happen. They're the events to be first-class citizens in your system. So that any kind of action that would result in a change of state, you emit a structured event notification for it. So you're effectively publishing the fact that this thing has happened, like an order has been raised. And then what I mean by kind of making that a first-class citizen is that you should really start to care just as much about knowing an order has been raised as you do about the data of the order. And that the events that a service publishes and listens for, I think as well, they become a really integral part of the definition of that service's interface, in the same way that the data structures that gets exposed are. So if you kind of look here, you often think about the interface of a service being its REST interface, its REST API interface. I mean, you can have RPC-based interfaces as well, but this is pretty common. So basically, it's the endpoints that it exposes that can be called to either execute some kind of functionality or retrieve its data. And then you also normally consider the structure of the data when you're thinking about, this is the interface for my service, my order service. This is what an order looks like, and this is how I interact with the service. You need to really expand that definition to also consider the events that are published in it or by it as well. And you might want to document and control the data model of your entire platform. It's a very important thing to do, really, to understand the data that each service exposes and manage some of the complexity and get alignment between your services and how you build your workflows. Certainly on a large platform, that kind of control and knowledge of the data structures is very important. And if you're doing that, creating a data model, you also need to make the events part of that model and consider them just as important. So if we go back to the order example and see how the event-driven approach would change that very slightly, or actually probably more than slightly. Here's the original example again, and that's more command-based. So the shopping cart and the order services are effectively commanding through post requests, and the stock service and the pick list service and the order service itself are kind of responding to those commands. In an event-driven approach, when the user purchases what's in the cart, the shopping cart service there on the left is just shouting about it. It's publishing an event that's saying, it's been submitted, they've purchased it. And then anything that's downstream from that, that in the workflow that needs to respond to it, subscribes to those events and picks it up and does whatever it needs to do, which maybe involves publishing new events that other services listen to as well. So the cart service or the order service, they no longer need to make direct calls to other services. Right? They don't even need to know that the other services exist because they're entirely decoupled. And you can think about how that lends itself well to extendability too, which makes it quicker, really, and cheaper to innovate on it with a pretty simplified example. So suppose that you have this retail system and you want to start offering a customer loyalty program. So whenever a customer places an order, they earn loyalty points. You probably want to update a points balance with every order that gets placed. So maybe you create a new service, let's say a loyalty account service. Now, without events, this is what that change might look like. You'll extend the order service to make a call to the loyalty account service whenever you place an order and you credit an amount of points. But that means you've got to open up the order service code to make the change. You've got to create the loyalty account service. Both services need to be deployed. And you've got a coupling there. You may even have two teams that need to be involved, depending on how you're kind of organized around the services. It's definitely, it's not a huge problem, perhaps. It's always doable, and we do this all the time. But there's an amount of friction that's created there when you're extending the functionality of the system. Contrasting that with an event-driven scenario, where you add the new service and listen out for the existing order raised event, compute the new loyalty balance within the loyalty account service, and there's no other changes necessary there, no additional coupling between the services. And it's an approach with much less friction. It makes it quicker and makes it easier to add on new parts to the system without changing what's already there. So you can achieve that kind of thing using messaging services. There's lots of different varieties of messaging, but there's a publish and subscribe PubSub variant of that. And that's really what you can use here. That's available in things like Amazon Simple Notification Service, RabbitMQ, Azure Service Bus as well. And in this case, the publisher doesn't need to know about the subscribers. There's a thing called a topic. They will publish a message to the topic, and then 0 or more subscribers will listen to the topic, and each of them will get a copy of that message. So that's like, very high level basis of event-driven architectures, and hopefully a quick overview of how it can change your approach from a command-based one to something that's more extendable. And I would expect most platforms to blend these things as well, so REST APIs and messaging as well. And hopefully between that, it makes your platform a little bit more powerful because you can innovate quicker on it and simplifies it in some respects. But another concept with events and with event architectures that takes events and probably elevates them even further is event streaming. And this is the part that I think can really significantly change how you think about data on a platform, and also change how you define the interface of your services. So event streams are actually sometimes referred to as data on the outside. And it's a real kind of paradigm shift from the more traditional approaches. And it's certainly a more complex and advanced topic. And I'm going to scratch the surface of it really, just to introduce it. But if an event is the fact that a change of state happened, or something happened that changed the state, then an event stream is most simply like the log of those events, those facts, just recorded in sequence over time. And at the heart of it, that's what an event stream is. It's a log. And it's normally implemented in a very scalable, distributed way to support kind of large cloud-based systems. Often, real-time data coming in like hundreds, thousands, millions of messages. And it's divided into topics like the PubSub messaging services. And in fact, PubSub is something that most event streams normally support. And the events that are captured in the log, they could live forever. In fact, it's a kind of matter of storage, or you can configure it to perhaps live just for a certain period of time, like depending on your use case. But with that log, you actually have a very full picture of every state change that's happened, perhaps to a particular entity. And you can start thinking about services reacting to the stream of changes as they happen. So if you think about the loyalty account service, that's going to be listening to that order raised. event, and it's going to be doing something to it to calculate the loyalty balance. But that too might be publishing its changes to an event stream topic. And in this case, what I've put on here is the loyalty balance topic. And this can be thought about slightly differently then from the order raised, perhaps, because the balance is going to increase with each new order, and it might decrease if you use the points on another order as well. And if you're kind of just capturing the fact that that's happened as a very simple state change that is, this number plus, this number minus, plus minus, that kind of thing as time goes on. If that's all published to the event stream, if you ever need to know the balance, you can just go back over the event stream and add it all up, starting at 0 or the start state, whatever that will be, and kind of replay the events on top of it. And that gives you the current balance of any customer. So now when you're publishing your events from the loyalty account service to a stream, you're actually publishing in that log all of the data that's exposed by that service. So the control of the logic for calculating the account balance and the publishing of the event, that's all still encapsulated within your loyalty account service, as it should be in a microservice world. But now the interface to query that data shifts in a very interesting way. You no longer have to query the loyalty account service to ask for the balance of the customer. It's just available by looking over the event stream. And that's why it's called data on the outside. Sometimes the control of the data is retained by the service, but the access to it isn't. It just lives within the streams. If you're using event streaming, you're going to be facilitated by some kind of event streaming platform, such as Kafka. And in addition to the pub sub approach and a very scalable storage mechanism for the event logs, it adds on something called event stream processing, which give you capabilities of actually working with the streams. And in Kafka, you use the Kafka Streams API as one method to access data from your streams. So you can respond to changes in state that happen, as our loyalty account service might do. But then also you have the option of tables as well, that let you kind of aggregate the events that happen into a table that represents a mutable current state, like a traditional SQL table, where each row represents the current state, and that row will change when that state changes, as opposed to immutable events that happen in the log. Once an event has happened, it has happened. Another event may happen later, but that first event still happened. So, maybe something consuming the loyalty account information could access it via a Kafka table that represents the current balance per person. And there's a technology as well, KSQLDB, with Kafka that lets you build stream processing applications in a very lightweight way. And in fact, that loyalty account service could very simply just be a stream processor. And you can think about that as a microservice in its own right, but it's just built using KSQLDB. That's taking the order stream and then emitting another stream, which is the loyalty balance stream, based on what it understands as happening from the order stream. So, you can also combine streams and data in ways that actually start to feel a little bit familiar to traditional relational database systems too. They give you some pretty powerful options of how you consume data. One pattern that people might be familiar with, because again, it's a fairly current pattern, is CQRS, the command query response segregation. And in there, you've got kind of optimizing for two different things. You're optimizing for being able to change the data, like accept commands and state that changes. But then also that model might look different from what you want to do if you want to read it in an efficient way. So you can use event streams and event stream processing pretty well for this. So let's say you want to provide on a screen a summary of someone's account. Let's kind of go back to the sort of Amazon example when you're looking at the website and you want to see an account summary. The commands that change details of the account all happen through various different streams, and it's a very efficient way of us doing it. but when someone requests the summary, to go through and build that up from, these streams may be stored somewhere else, like they may be stored cached in tables or something, but to go and join that data from maybe orders, maybe you've got that on there, plus you've got the account balance and other bits of information. To do all that when you want to query it is probably a very inefficient query. But you can have a stream processor that aggregates the data as it happens, and then spits that out as a more efficient query model to read most efficiently. So when you're querying the account summary service for its data, it already has it in a really nicely digestible form. So, it's just some of the things that event stream processing and event streaming can really give you. There's a lot more that can be said about it as a topic, and certainly a lot to consider. Things like how you design your topics, how you design your schemas, that kind of thing. And I would say one of the definite disadvantages that you see with event streaming is the steep learning curve, that there's so much done that is actually pretty different to how you may have been thinking about data and microservices even before. Look, there is a lot of information out there. And one particularly good resource that I would recommend to anyone is the Confluent website. And just kind of throw up on there. Confluent's a platform that lets you run Kafka. But they have a huge amount of information just about event streaming and Kafka that's well worth looking at. So, kind of whistle-stop tour of a couple of different architectural concepts. And I think you can see through that developing a platform can be complex. There's lots of different technology approaches in any platform of a real size, lots of moving parts. Developing a platform takes a significant amount of thought and energy, and controlling it can be difficult. It could be a huge amount of chaos. And there are some key practices that I think engineering organizations should consider that might help with that, help kind of tame it a little bit. One of those is feature teams. And a feature team is a team that's responsible for the implementation of a whole customer-focused feature. And that might, and often does, include like front-end and back-end implementation. And in a platform world, it's probably creating domain services, consumer or extending new ones, core services, and that sort of thing to create a whole user-focused feature. And it's a single team that does all of that. So the team's got to be cross-functional. They've got to either have the skills or be able to acquire the skills they need to do everything that feature requires. Because I mean, if you can help it, I would always say, don't make a distinction between your kind of teams that work on applications and your teams that work on the platform that supports the applications. I think you're much better to think of every team as a feature team that can do application and platform work together. So you'll probably have some specialization in areas, domain areas and things like that, but I think it's an approach to work towards, because you want them to be able to work, therefore, without dependencies on other teams. So you don't create a front-end team and a back-end team, because then when you're developing a feature, one team has to wait for the other to do some work and to complete the feature. And then you've got the whole issue of multiple backlogs and bottlenecks to contend with. And with that, obviously, in a microservices architecture, the common pattern is that a team owns a service from the cradle to the grave, and that service provides a discrete bit of functionality, as we just discussed. But end-to-end workflow designed as a feature could span multiple services in the scope of its changes. Hopefully, you've limited it as much as possible through decoupling, but that's not always totally possible. But if you follow the feature team pattern, you don't want to be reliant on another team to make some changes. You need kind of a way of handling that. And that's where inner source can start to be useful, or at least attempt to be useful. Because again, it's a tricky thing to manage. So what inner source is, as it probably sounds a little bit like, it takes the principles of open source where you've got a project and you're taking input from multiple different parties that aren't directly part of the same team. And you've got a layer of project ownership and oversight that keeps quality high. And you apply that to your company internal projects. So an internal project in the case of a platform dev organization could be a service, domain service or a core service. It could also just be some library components, or it could be some DevOps tooling, that kind of thing. But the idea is to promote reuse and sharing, and then alleviate those bottlenecks that I mentioned that are created when your team depends on something that someone else owns. But it also can help you maybe crowdsource some projects, get some more diverse, innovative ideas from across your organization. So you don't wait for another team to make a change. You can make that change. You're empowered to do that, but that's still then reviewed by the owners for some quality assurance and consistency. But to do this, you need a consistent inner source strategy that your whole organization understands, and that needs to have a process and a standard for documentation. So a consumer of a project knows how to use it because of the documentation, and they know if they want to contribute it, how they submit changes. There's a process for that that's documented. There might be coding standards embedded into that project documentation. Processes for requesting changes if you're not making them, or logging issues that are found. It needs a strong ownership model as well, where you've got a set of owners, and trusted committer is a role that is commonly used in both open and inner source. Who's allowed to review submissions from other teams, and who do you discuss changes with? And that discussion needs a decent communication strategy. Like, how do people reach out to the owners and talk about things on the project? You need a really well-agreed process around pull request submissions and acceptance of them, including things like how much time people can expect to spend within a sprint looking at other people's submissions, because you reduce the bottleneck of having another team make the change, but you want that team to review it pretty quickly. So you need agreements and norms around that. And then as your platform grows, or as your kind of organization grows, you need to think about how people will discover these sorts of projects. DevOps is the next kind of key principle I wanted to mention. It's another whole story as well, but it's one of those terms that gets used a lot. I won't go deeply because I'm kind of conscious of time. But you want your teams to be able to build and deploy and monitor everything in production seamlessly. And pipelines to automate everything. It should all be repeatable. Going from code check-in to deployment to production should be a non-event, really. You want it done as frequently as possible. And I'd really recommend spending time up front developing some self-service tools, or implementing some existing ones that let teams do it themselves, and educating them on it. And for that, actually, a DevOps team is useful. So in principle, the dev teams own DevOps for their projects, but a dedicated DevOps team that is dedicated to facilitating it is a valuable investment to make. And also making sure your builds and deployment pipelines and things like that are configured at the start before you even get into writing the code is pretty important. Now, my last mention is on shifting left. And you can shift left on pretty much everything. Specifically, I mean on testing and security though here. So shifting left on quality and on testing means moving the testing to the start of the process, designing the tests, building or designing your system in such a way that it's going to be testable. It also means focusing on the lower levels of tests, the things that will run earlier in the process, like unit tests. And there's this classic test pyramid where the majority of your tests are that broad thing at the bottom, and they should be the fast executing and frequently executing unit tests that give you the most early warning if something's wrong. And then as you go up the pyramid, the tests get bigger, they get longer to execute, and they can get more brittle as well as they involve more components working together. So you want fewer of them. You need them, but you want fewer of them. And on security, you should care deeply about security because your customers most definitely do. You should think about it from the ground up. like with quality, you should build security into your systems, into your platform. Things like building vulnerability scanning into your DevOps pipeline, that sort of thing. Security in cloud platform development is a huge concern. So that was a huge amount of topics, I think, really, and it's meant to give you a flavor for what platform development means and what it can do for you. So kind of bringing that all together in summary, focusing on developing a platform as opposed to products can really help your teams innovate quicker. You can use things like microservices and event streaming as enabling architectural patterns, and then also think about different approaches to development processes in organizations, like feature teams, inner source, and so on, that will set you up to be successful in platform development. Because it's complex, but it's also incredibly interesting and very powerful. So attention in the right places can really boost your capacity as an organization to deliver. So that that's it from me on the talk. So I guess I can probably open up for any questions if we have time. I'm not sure how much time we have. Stop sharing as well.
Hello. Yeah,
Hey.
you're back. So you can turn your camera on?
Yes, I didn't realize it was off. Okay.
Yeah. So any questions for John? Okay.
You're letting me off lightly.
Sorry?
They're letting me off lightly.
No. I'm gonna ask you a question. So what's 1 second, please. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm asking the same question I asked our first speaker from today, Damian, about cloud or developing on cloud or cloud platforms. They're quite dependent on the logistics and the platform. And we saw that happening with Facebook and WhatsApp just a few weeks earlier. How can we avoid like system shutdowns on large scales?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you're right. When you're on the cloud, you're at the mercy sometimes of things that are outside of your hand, because you're generally relying on other things provided as a service. Your platforms rely on other people's platforms a lot of the time. And you see that Microsoft and Google and AWS, they're all mature organizations, but they do have problems occasionally. And that can then have a huge impact on your own software that's running in the cloud if something goes wrong. What you need really, you need to think about failovers, making sure you're always in multiple regions. With any of the platforms, you should think about what are your alternative options and how quickly could you move to it. So infrastructure as code from a DevOps point of view is also something you should really invest in. How quickly could you spin up your Kubernetes environment in somewhere else that is currently running? And then monitoring and alerting. So using a platform like New Relic, for example, or Datadog, or something that's giving you a current view of what your system is doing is also really important. So you need to know kind of instantly when you're seeing warning signs of something going wrong, so that you can then react to it, hopefully before it actually becomes a problem. Yeah, I would say, thinking about redundancy, failover, thinking about how you'll respond in a sort of disaster scenario, and then also monitoring to make sure you're aware exactly of what's happening.
Yeah, makes you think of, it looks like a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's the cloud, so it's going to go wrong at some point. You just need to be able to handle it when it does. It's not you're never going to stop it.
Yeah, Facebook and WhatsApp, it's not, they run on cloud, but imagine if something like AWS or Google or something.
Everyone's down.
Yeah, everyone is done. So thank you very much. Really insightful look in cloud platforms and programming and any kind of software related. I guess if anyone watched this who watched this conference can really find you fast on Twitter or something, if they have like
yeah, it's find it on LinkedIn probably.
Oh, or LinkedIn, yeah. If it's stuff related to his presentation. Thank you very much, John.
No problem. It was a pleasure.
And have a great day.
Thanks.
Ne mutăm acum mai departe cu următorul speaker, Alexandra Iacob, care este un dezvoltator de aplicații mobile cu o vastă experiență în folosirea mai multor tehnologii. Este dornică să-și asume noi provocări întotdeauna, iar în ultimii 2 ani, pe lângă rolul ei tehnice, a preluat și responsabilitatea de a îngriji și coordona multiple comunități tehnice în Nagaro, Mobile, User Experience, C++, Python și DWH. Alexandra, ne auzim?
Da.
Uite că ne auzim.
Mă auziți?
Da, da.
Întrebare. Țin prezentarea în română, engleză?
Română.
Română, ok. În primul rând, mersi tare mult tuturor pentru participare și că sunteți astăzi aici cu noi. Eu sunt Alexandra, sunt mobile developer de aproximativ 11 ani. În Nagaro de 8 ani jumate, aproape 9, imediat. Din întâmplare, astăzi chiar sunt împreună cu o mare parte dintre colegii mei din echipa de mobile, care se uită la mine. Sper să nu stârnesc foarte multe discuții și contradicții după prezentarea de astăzi aici. Ca și un intro în ceea ce o să povestim astăzi, toată ideea topicului pe care o să vi-l prezint a început acum 2 luni, când am fost invitată la o conferință globală în cadrul companiei noastre, o conferință despre arhitectură. Și ca și mulți alții din domeniu, mi-am pus și eu întrebarea dacă într-adevăr există sau nu o zonă sau o nevoie pentru rolul de mobile architecture în IT. Categoric, nu o să vă mint, m-am prezentat de multe ori sub tutela de mobile architect, de cele mai multe ori din cauza nevoii sau cererii din partea clienților. Dar ca și mulți alții din domeniu, am stat de multe ori să mă gândesc dacă într-adevăr există sau nu, dacă stăm să ne gândim ca și complexitate sau facem o comparație între complexitatea unui proiect de backend, să nu mai vorbim de ceea ce înseamnă un system architecture. Categoric, proiectele sau complexitatea proiectelor de mobile este mult mai redusă și atunci ne gândim chiar există nevoia unui rol. Am stat de multe ori să mă gândesc că am expectanțe de la colegii din echipele mele să acopere nevoia sau definirea unei structuri de aplicații de mobile încă începând din zona de senior engineer, fără să mai vorbim de tech lead. Și atunci, sinceră să fiu, nu pot să zic că am neapărat un răspuns pentru această întrebare. Ce aș vrea să acoperim astăzi este să trecem un pic împreună peste ce înseamnă definirea unei soluții de mobile și poate reușim, de ce nu, să și răspundem la această întrebare. Pe tot parcursul prezentării, dacă vreți să mă întrerupeți, să discutăm anumite topicuri, puteți să o faceți liniștiți. Primul lucru pe care aș vrea să-l povestim este care sunt challenge-urile sau ce trebuie să acoperim, de ce trebuie să ținem cont în momentul în care definim o soluție de mobile. Dacă de multe ori în zonă de backend, arhitectura este dată poate de diferite integrări dintre diferite sisteme, în zona de mobile, de cele mai multe ori, arhitectura este dată de setul de feature-uri pe care trebuie să-l acoperim, de diferite device-uri mobile pe care trebuie să le suportăm, Categoric avem nevoie și de diferite integrări, fie că este vorba de un sistem extern de la care ne luăm anumite informații, că este vorba de un sistem de autentificare sau pur și simplu sisteme externe ce ne fac enable la alte funcționalități, push notification, analytics și așa mai departe. Dar de multe ori ne lovim de alte nevoi sau constraint-uri care vin din partea clienților. Nu o să vă mint, de multe ori mobile nu este neapărat cea mai importantă parte pentru un client. De multe ori vine ca ceva adițional la tot ce înseamnă parte de back-end sau front-end, web. Și atunci pentru noi tot timpul apar foarte multe restricții, să le zic așa. Dacă vă uitați în prezentarea mea, am pus zona de technology stack un pic separată de toate celelalte considerente. Și asta este pentru că de multe ori partea de tehnologie sau alegerea tehnologiei pe care o folosim într-un proiect de mobile, de fapt este chiar definită sau depinde de toate celelalte. Și sincer cu asta aș vrea să intru mai mult în detalii în primă fază. Cum alegem o tehnologie de mobile sau de ce depinde ea? În primul rând, trebuie să ținem cont de anumite costuri, de bugetul pe care un client îl are. Trebuie să ținem cont de user experience-ul pe care clienții vor să îl ofere userilor. Sunt diferite modalități prin care putem să creăm o aplicație de mobile. Putem să mergem pe un user experience platform specific, să ne asigurăm că toată interfața unei aplicații este în așa fel dezvoltată încât este foarte intuitivă pentru un user de Android sau un user de iOS care folosește zi de zi sistemul respectiv de operare. Trebuie să ținem cont de anumite limitări de performanță pe care diferite tehnologii de mobile le are. Trebuie să ținem cont de alte cerințe, printre care offline supportul, care este acoperit mai mult sau mai puțin de diferite tehnologii de mobile. Ținem cont de diferite KPI-uri de security, dar un impact foarte mare îl are complexitatea business-ului. Și hai să trecem un pic mai în detaliu aș vrea să facem cumva o comparație între diferite tehnologii de mobile. Dacă vă uitați un pic pe prezentarea pe care vă share-uiesc, o să merg cu o comparație între o aplicație native, adică implementată folosind SDK-urile de Android și iOS, cross-platform, unde probabil știți deja de-a lungul ultimelor ani au apărut tot mai multe tehnologii cross-platform. O să enumăr câteva. Avem Flutter, Xamarin, unde am avut chiar două framework-uri diferite, React Native, Kotlin Multiplatform, este iar o tehnologie apărută în ultimii ani care a prins tot mai multă atracție din partea developerilor. Dar avem inclusiv tehnologii hybrid, care ce înseamnă că este o combinație între un container nativ și un content dezvoltat într-o platformă web. Primul lucru pe care vreau să-l acoperim este partea de costuri. Dacă în partea de native avem niște costuri mai crescute în partea inițială a dezvoltării, pentru că trebuie să implementăm două codebase-uri diferite pentru Android și iOS, pe zona de cross-platform și hybrid, în schimb, avem mai puține costuri în partea inițială, dar avem un risc foarte mare ca ulterior, în momentul în care vrem să adăugăm feature-uri noi sau în zona de suport și mentenanță, să avem alte costuri la care de multe ori clienții nu se gândesc. Totdeauna clientul vine, vreau un single code base pentru că vreau să reduc costurile. Asta poate sau nu să fie adevărat. Se poate ca, sau riscurile cele mai mari în zona de costuri pe soluții cross-platform și hybrids sunt de fapt dependențele de framework. De multe ori ne trezim că anumite third-party plugin-uri pe care le folosim nu sunt reținute și atunci avem nevoie nu doar să avem experți pe framework-ul de cross-platform, respectiv hybrid pe care îl folosim, ci s-ar putea să avem nevoie să creștem echipa noastră de developeri și cu experți pe zona de native care să poată aduce la zi aceste third-party libraries. La fel, partea de customizare sau adăugare de noi feature-uri. Limitarea vine sau problemele pot să apară din aceeași nevoie. Chiar dacă framework-ul acoperă funcționalitățile principale a unei aplicații de mobile, în cazul în care vrem sau avem nevoie de anumite funcționalități platform specific, pot să dau niște exemple. Poate vrem să facem o integrare cu Siri sau Google Assistant. Poate vrem să implementăm, de exemplu, pe Android o funcționalitate de home screen widget. De multe ori ne trezim că framework-ul cross-platform sau hybrid pe care îl folosim să nu acopere nevoile acestea și atunci să avem nevoie să facem implementarea nativ. Aici, la fel, o să discutăm pe parcurs și de pros, cons, de cum putem să obținem asta, dar este neapărat nevoie să ținem cont în zona de costuri de aceste limitări. Trecând mai departe la zona de user experience, performance și offline support, la fel am încercat să fac o comparație între aceste trei modalități de a dezvolta o aplicație de mobile. Categoric, din punct de vedere a user experience-ului, a look and feel-ului pe care o aplicație nativă o oferă unui end user, nu se compară cu nimic altceva. Toată partea de tranziție dintre screen-uri, micro-interaction, cum am zis și adineauri, intuitiv, cât de intuitive sunt componentele de UI din Android, respectiv iOS SDK, nu o să putem să obținem în celelalte tehnologii. Categoric, dacă mergem pe o tehnologie cross-platform, mai ales în zona de Flutter, deja obținem o performanță mult mai ridicată, care poate să ne apropie oarecum de ceea ce înseamnă nativ. Dar dacă vrem să facem sau să acoperim și partea aceasta de platform specific, UI components, ajungem de multe ori suntem obligați să implementăm două zone de UI pentru a acoperi nevoia aceasta și atunci stăm să ne gândim, oare mai merită toată trecerea pe o tehnologie cross-platform? Cât de mult ne ridică costurile? Cât de mult codebase comun mai obținem? Și de multe ori, în momentul în care încercăm să alegem o tehnologie cross-platform, tot ceea ce înseamnă, până la urmă, alegerea este în a obține o balanță, în a analiza toate aceste costuri și limitări și, până la urmă, KPI-urile pe care un client le dorește în a lua o decizie. Pe lângă partea aceasta, trebuie să ne uităm un pic, cum am zis, și la zona cumva mai grea din implementarea unei aplicații de mobile. Și aici mă refer la niște funcționalități pe care de multe ori clienții nu au de unde să știe că nu sunt suportate în diferite tehnologii sau că ar putea să aibă anumite vulnerabilități. Dacă ne uităm un pic pe partea de platform specific functionalities, cum am mai menționat, categoric avem diferite soluții cross-platform care pot să obțină lucrurile acestea. Again, riscul care se ridică este de suportul pe care îl oferă acea tehnologie în momentul în care vorbim de un update de OS. Cât de repede își actualizează noua versiune de framework pentru a debloca dezvoltarea sau integrarea noului API în framework-ul respectiv. Iar dacă vorbim de partea de hybrids, aici avem niște limitări foarte mari. De multe ori putem să zicem chiar că nu putem obține sau nu putem implementa anumite funcționalități platform-specific folosind anumite tehnologii hibride. Pot să dau câteva exemple ca să fie un pic mai concret ceea ce vreau să zic. Dacă ne gândim la o tehnologie de Cordova sau Ionic, care până la urmă este un container web, dacă ne gândim la o aplicație de Android, containerul web este o componentă de UI. Știm cu toții că în momentul în care punem aplicația în background, componentele de UI se distrug. Ceea ce înseamnă că noi nu mai putem pur și simplu să rulăm JavaScript-ul respectiv. Cu toții știm că aplicațiile de mobile în ultimii ani au tot mai multe nevoi de background features. Nu vrem ca userii noștri neapărat să stea cu telefonul deblocat, cu aplicația pornită ca să poată să folosească diferite funcționalități pe care framework-ul ni le expune. Poate vrem să folosim un localization feature, poate vrem să ne bazăm pe diferite alte API-uri pe care hardware-ul ni le expune. Și asta este tot mai greu să obținem în parte de hybrid. Am auzit un sunet ciudat, nu știu ce înseamnă. Sper că mă auziți bine. Dacă poate cineva să-mi dea un feedback. Mă auziți oară? Ok, super, mersi frumos. O altă limitare poate să fie partea de securitate. Știm cu toții că zona de web expune diferite vulnerabilități la partea de securitate. Toți clienții care, dacă ne uităm în industrie de finance, dacă vorbim de o aplicație din zona de enterprise, care are cerințe foarte ridicate pe partea de securitate, știm cu toții care suntem în domeniul de mobile development, că atât Android SDK-ul cât și iOS SDK-ul a făcut foarte multe improvement-uri în ultimii ani pentru a crește partea de securitate a aplicațiilor mobile. Cu siguranță toți clienții își doresc să acopere cât mai bine această arie, mai ales dacă vorbim de date senzitive. Să nu mai vorbim de tot ceea ce a apărut în zona de GDPR în ultimii ani. Și atunci, dacă facem o comparație, din nou, partea de mobile acoperă cel mai bine toată această parte. Avem tot mai multe layere de encriptare, tot mai multe zone de a salva sau a persista datele dintr-o aplicație de mobile la care tot mai greu se poate ajunge. Chiar dacă în zona de cross-platform de multe ori putem obține aceleași funcționalități, aici mă refer la parte de Flutter, care poate să folosească aceleași metode de persistare pe care le folosim și o aplicație nativă. Același lucru se întâmplă în zona de React Native. Unde avem totuși o limitare este faptul că suntem dependenți de anumite third-party libraries sau plugin-uri sau packages, cum se numesc în diferite framework-uri, care să ne facă enable aceste funcționalități. Ceea ce înseamnă că la un moment dat, dacă OS-ul de Android sau iOS expune layere noi de securitate, trebuie să așteptăm ca framework-ul să acopere sau să expună o astfel de implementare sau, dacă nu, să ne creăm noi un code base sau să expunem o implementare nativă pentru aceste funcționalități, ceea ce, din nou, ne reduce cumva toată motivația pentru care am ales o tehnologie cross-platform, și anume să avem un single code base. Ultima zonă pe care vreau să o mai acopăr în partea aceasta de comparație este, într-adevăr, vine cumva din experiența mea și a colegilor mei cu care am lucrat de-a lungul anilor, ce fel de aplicații aș recomanda sau ce fel de tehnologie aș recomanda pentru diferite soluții și tehnologii de mobile. Fără niciun fel de dubiu, dacă vorbim de o aplicație cu o complexitate de business foarte ridicată, dacă vorbim poate de o soluție de enterprise, file management, dacă vorbim poate de chiar mai mult, nu neapărat de o aplicație de mobile, ci de un SDK, recomandarea mea ar fi să mergem pe o soluție de native. Dacă vorbim de o aplicație cu o complexitate mai mică, sau chiar dacă este o complexitate mai mare, dar nu are așa de multe nevoi de implementare diferită, adică de platform-specific functionalities. Dacă vorbim de o soluție care poate face foarte mult handling la date, luăm diferite informații din sisteme externe și le prezentăm în UI, categoric nu o să avem foarte multe diferențe. Fără niciun dubiu, aș recomanda o soluție de cross-platform și fără niciun fel de stat pe gânduri, aș merge personal pe Flutter, pentru că a schimbat foarte mult tot ceea ce înseamnă partea de performanță și acoperire de feature-uri. Cumva Google-ul, fiind în spatele acestei tehnologii, a intrat foarte tare în tot ce înseamnă acoperire de diferite funcționalități de care ne folosim într-o aplicație de mobile. A expus încă de la început tot ce înseamnă stack de Firebase, care cu toții știm că într-o soluție de mobile este, dacă nu mandatory, și aici mă refer la anumite funcționalități gen push notification, dar ne ușurează foarte, foarte mult munca prin diferite framework-uri gen ML-Kit, dacă mai ales în context de un medium sau low complexity application, poate nici măcar nu avem nevoie de un backend și vrem să mergem pe o soluție serverless. Ne oferă aceste funcționalități. Trebuie să zic că personal o soluție de hybrid aș propune doar într-un context foarte, foarte specific. Și chiar am pregătit pentru voi mai departe astăzi o astfel de soluție. Ce aș vrea să facem în continuare este chiar să trecem prin niște arhitecturi pe care le-am definit de-a lungul anilor, în diferite contexte, cu diferite nevoi sau cerințe, constraint-uri, din cele menționate mai anterior, și să vedem ce înseamnă definirea unei arhitecturi de mobile. Bun. primul lucru peste care vrem să ne uităm este o aplicație standard de mobile. Ceea ce vedem de cele mai multe ori într-o aplicație simplă în care poate avem niște funcționalități basic, avem un login, avem o autentificare a sesiunii, luăm niște date de la niște sisteme externe, poate luăm niște date inclusiv din partea hardware-ului pe care îl are device-ul și le prezentăm în UI. Aici nu o să merg pe o comparație sau pe o anumită variantă de tehnologie, pentru că, cum am zis și mai devreme, în funcție de cât de mult cod comun putem să avem, putem să mergem pe o tehnologie sau cealaltă. Ce încerc să pușez foarte mult în zona aceasta, împreună cu colegii mei, este să mergem pe un separation of concern. Noi, ca și echipă, lucrăm foarte mult pe o arhitectură modulară. Încercăm pe cât posibil să facem separare, cel puțin între layerele de presentation, domain, și anume business logic, și partea de networking. De ce facem asta? Este pentru că de-a lungul anilor am văzut că de foarte multe ori ajungem în situația în care avem clienți care vin și după 2-3 ani vor să facă un rebranding la aplicație sau poate vor să introducă un sistem nou în partea de backend. Și nu ne dorim în niciun fel să trebuiască să afectăm întreg codebase-ul pentru a face aceste schimbări. Categoric, în funcție de nevoi, poate să avem și o persistare, poate să avem și un local DB. Putem să discutăm de modulul de models. Am avut diferite discuții, sunt persoane care vor să urmeze îndeaproape tot ceea ce recomandă Clean Architecture-ul și anume să avem modulele și să le parsăm de la un layer la altul în diferite modele de date. Aici, sincer, personal, iau decizia de la nevoie la nevoie. Dacă este vorba de o aplicație simplă, unde de multe ori modelul de date ajunge din layerul de network până în presentation fără modificări, cu atât mai mult că ce ne dorim în zona de mobile este să încercăm să luăm la un moment dat doar datele de care avem nevoie la momentul respectiv pentru a face improve la performance. Ajungem de multe ori în situația aceasta în care formatul modelului de date pe care îl primim din zona de networking să rămână neschimbat până în zona de UI. Și atunci nu întotdeauna merg pe acest model de a parsa modelul de date dintr-un layer în altul. Întotdeauna mă duc, în schimb, pe varianta aceasta când modelul de date se schimbă. Dar, cum am zis, cel puțin personal îmi place să încerc nu neapărat să urmez constant un design pattern sau o arhitectură care este foarte folosită pe piață, ci încerc să mă gândesc și ce se aplică pe proiectul curent. Nu vreau să complic foarte mult arhitectura dacă nu este nevoie de ea. Acum, dacă vorbim de design pattern sau dacă am menționat de ele, în zona de presentation, în funcție de tehnologii, folosim diferite abordări. Categoric, dacă vorbim de o aplicație nativă de Android, cred că majoritatea developerilor de Android o să meargă pe MVVM, tocmai pentru că și framework-ul ne ajută în direcția aceasta. Am avut diferite discuții cu colegi pe zonă de iOS, de ce framework-uri să se folosească. Știm cu toții că de-a lungul anilor s-a jonglat cu diferite design pattern-uri. Dacă la început o mare parte dintre aplicații foloseau MVC, Pe urmă, mulți dintre noi probabil s-au jucat cu alte design pattern-uri, Viper, de exemplu. Cu toate acestea, în ultimii ani am văzut că tot mai mult prinde zona de MVVM, inclusiv pe aplicații de iOS. Dacă vorbim de Flutter, pe de altă parte, din ce am văzut, majoritatea jonglează între state management-ul folosind package-ul de bloc sau un MVP. Până la urmă, atâta timp cât ne asigurăm că ne structurăm în așa fel în codul încât să acoperim best practice-urile, nu cred că putem să zicem neapărat cu niciun fel de dubii că un design pattern în zona de UI este mai bun sau mai puțin bun decât celălalt. De ce îmi place structura aceasta modulară, pe lângă argumentele pe care le-am dat legat de rebranding sau înlocuirea unei integrări, este și faptul că separarea de business logic ne ajută să unit testăm chiar și 100% layer-ul de domain, unde știm cu toții că este zona cea mai error prompted pentru o aplicație de mobile, dar pe de altă parte îmi place să acopăr inclusiv zona de view model cu unit teste. Hai să mai vedem și un alt tip de aplicații cu care, ca și developer de mobile, ne lovim destul de des. Ziceam la început că în zona de mobile, de multe ori, arhitectura nu este neapărat dată de anumite integrări de care avem nevoie în sistemul sau în produsul nostru, ci de cele mai multe ori este dictat de ce fel de funcționalități trebuie să acoperim. Și asta vreau să povestim acum împreună dacă discutăm de un configurable mobile app. Ce înseamnă un configurable mobile app? Tot mai des am întâlnit, mai ales dacă ați lucrat nu neapărat pe un application, ci pe un library de mobile, nevoia de a putea expune funcționalitățile configurabile la runtime. Sau nu neapărat. Dacă vrem să lăsăm clientul din background să poată face enable sau disable la anumite funcționalități. Poate dacă sunteți user de Android, sunteți familiar cu Instant App-ul. Foarte pe scurt, ce este Instant App-ul? Este o funcționalitate pe care Androidul o expune, prin care nu trebuie neapărat să-ți instalezi aplicația pe device permanent, ci poți doar temporar să instalezi anumite părți a unei aplicații. Ca să dau un exemplu, dacă vrei la un moment dat, nu știu, ai un cont pe un portal de banking. Multe dintre aplicațiile de banking au enable această funcționalitate de Instant App, prin care dacă cauți pe Google cum poți să transfer bani folosind un anumit cont bancar, s-ar putea să fii prompted cu această opțiune de a face enable la Instant App Functionality pentru aplicația respectivă bancară, ceea ce înseamnă că temporar sistemul de operare îți instalează funcționalitatea respectivă din acea aplicație, folosești feature-ul respectiv, după care poți să îl dezinstalezi. Dacă vrem să expunem asemenea funcționalități, categoric design-ul pe care vi l-am prezentat anterior este destul de greoi. Nu neapărat că nu acoperă nevoia, dar asta înseamnă că aplicația care folosește SDK-ul tău sau Instant App-ul o să-ți expună toată funcționalitatea și nu-ți dorești asta. Și atunci, de multe ori, ce facem este că merg la fel ca și la soluția precedentă, pe separare între presentation, domain și networking, dar s-ar putea să am mai multe module, chiar dacă în diagrama pe care o vedeți am prezentat doar în zonă de UI, de multe ori ajung inclusiv zona de business logic sau networking să o împart pe mai multe module, în așa fel încât aplicația finală să poată să selecteze ce fel de module vrea să folosească sau să integreze. Nu este ceva foarte complicat, dar ajută foarte mult în momentul în care avem asemenea funcționalități pentru a optimiza partea de build size al aplicației noastre. Mai departe, o altă soluție despre care am vrut să povestim împreună este partea de suport pentru diferite tipuri de device-uri mobile. De multe ori în mobile development nu vorbim doar de development pentru un telefon mobil sau pentru o tabletă. Vorbim inclusiv de soluții pentru smartwatches sau Android Auto, Apple Car și așa mai departe. Tot mai des ni se întâmplă să vină clienții cu diferite cerințe de a acoperi multiple devices și categoric, de când cu toate beneficiile pe care ni le expun anumite soluții de cross-platform, de cele mai multe ori ele vin însoțite și cu întrebarea: putem să refolosim sau nu parte din codul pe care îl avem deja scris pe o soluție de mobile phone și pentru wearables? Putem să refolosim, poate, sau să scriem un singur codebase care să poată fi folosit atât pentru aplicația de mobile cât și pentru aplicația de wearables? Și aici vreau în continuare să prezint două aplicații sau două soluții pe care le-am dezvoltat în trecut, care să acopere aceste funcționalități. Prima dintre ele este o cerință de a folosi un singur codebase, atât pentru o aplicație de Android iOS phone, cât și pentru 3 variante de smartwatches. Mai concret, a fost o cerință de a acoperi Apple Watch, Samsung Watch și Huawei Watch. Primul lucru la care ne-am gândit, ok, ce variante avem de a acoperi nevoia de single code base pentru Android iOS. Și aici am avut multe variante. Dar în momentul în care ne-am uitat și la funcționalitățile cerute de client, ne-am dat seama că avem foarte... Vin imediat, Silviu, și cu un răspuns la întrebarea ta. Ne-am dat seama că clientul își dorește în această soluție foarte multe funcționalități platform specific. Avea nevoie de integrare cu Siri și Google Assistant. Avea nevoie de integrare cu hardware, atât cu camera, cât și cu Bluetooth Low Energy. Ceea ce înseamnă că avea nevoie inclusiv de background task-uri. Aveam o funcționalitate de geofencing, care însemna că avem nevoie de parte de localization. Și în momentul în care am făcut o analiză a tuturor acestor nevoi, ne-am dat seama că singurele soluții care acoperă într-adevăr cerințele clientului sunt React Native și Flutter. Eu personal pot să zic că pe React Native am lucrat în companie undeva la 7-8 luni de zile, dacă nu mă înșel. Dacă comparativ cu o soluție de hybrid, adică web-based, categorii React Native era mai performant cele mai multe probleme le-am avut tocmai în zona aceasta de integrare cu hardware-ul. Am găsit la momentul respectiv foarte puține plugin-uri care să acopere ambele platforme și mai puține care chiar să funcționeze. Problema era la momentul respectiv, cel puțin recunosc că în ultimul an nici nu am mai încercat să jonglăm cu React Native-ul. La momentul respectiv, problema era că Flutter-ul, care este de fapt dezvoltatorul soluției nu Flutter-ul, Facebook-ul, care era dezvoltatorul soluției de React Native, avea third-party libraries sau acoperea în framework-ul respectiv doar funcționalitățile principale. În momentul în care te loveai de un feature mai aparte, trebuia să te bazezi pe un third-party library. Și toți developerii cred că știm că aici tot timpul avem riscul de a renunța dezvoltatorul third-party-ului la mentenanța soluției. Cred că până la urmă cu toată soluția de Cordova aici a fost cea mai mare problemă. Majoritatea plugin-urilor nu mai sunt updatate de 2-3 ani de zile. Și este un risc foarte mare pentru un client, mai ales dacă își propune să folosească soluția pe termen lung. Acum, Silviu, venind la întrebarea ta, ce părere am despre Xamarin? Sinceră să fiu, până la apariția Flutter-ului, ar fi fost soluția pe care aș fi recomandat-o cel mai mult în zona de cross-platform. Știm cu toții că Xamarin a expus de-a lungul timpului 2 framework-uri. Sper să nu le încurc, n-am mai folosit Xamarin, recunosc de mulți ani. Dacă nu mă înșel, Xamarin Core-ul era varianta care permitea doar scrierea unui codebase comun pe zona de business logic și networking, dar partea de UI trebuia să o implementez folosind native SDK pe cele 2 tehnologii. Știu că acest framework a avut o performanță chiar foarte bună, dovadă fiind și acoperirea pe piață, încă sunt foarte mulți clienți și foarte mulți developeri care folosesc Xamarin Core pentru dezvoltare. Din păcate, framework-ul de Xamarin Lite, dacă nu mă înșel, se numea, care acoperea și un codebase comun pe zonă de UI, a fost destul de problematic și nu a prins foarte mult. Acum, revenind la comparația cu Flutter-ul, după ce am testat, sincer, în companie diferite tehnologii și după ce ne-am lovit de diferite probleme în soluțiile noastre pentru clienți, la un moment dat, dacă nu mă înșel, undeva acum 3 ani de zile, am hotărât la nivel de echipă să nu mai propunem nicio tehnologie nouă de mobile clienților noștri până când nu le testăm noi intern. Și având deja cumva o experiență destul de vastă în diferite tehnologii, aveam deja și niște criterii pe care le urmăream de la o soluție cross-platform sau hybrid. Aveam o listă de funcționalități cu care ne-am lovit de cel mai multe ori. Mă repet, offline mode, background functionalities, integrare de hardware, performanță și security. Erau lucrurile la care tot timpul ne uitam. Și asta am făcut și în 2019 cu tehnologia de Flutter. Cumva a fost și un context foarte potrivit pentru că în sediul din Cluj, la momentul respectiv, aveam o problemă destul de mare internă. La momentul respectiv eram undeva la 400 și ceva de colegi în locația din Cluj și aveam doar 100 de locuri de parcare. Toată lumea care locuiește în Cluj știe că locurile de parcare sunt o problemă imensă. Și atunci aveam foarte multe discuții cine primește un loc de parcare, cum facem handling la locurile de parcare, pentru că de multe ori observam că colegii care aveau alocat un asemenea loc se întâmpla să se întâmple ceva și să nu mai vină cu mașina și uitau să anunțe și atunci locul de parcare rămânea nefolosit, cu toate că multă lume avea nevoie de el. Și ce am făcut a fost că am hotărât să facem o implementare, o aplicație de mobile. Vreau să facem atât pentru Android cât și pentru iOS ca să putem acoperi o gamă cât mai largă dintre colegii noștri. Categoric să ne asigurăm că toată lumea poate folosi soluția. Am mers și pe o soluție de web. Am făcut tot o soluție de web și pe partea de administrare pentru a putea face handling la modul de alocare, la diferite edge case-uri, la diferite situații în care colegii veneau în delegație sau aveam nevoie mai critic de un loc de parcare. Și cred că a fost o soluție foarte bună pentru că ne-a permis să jonglăm cu absolut toate criteriile pe care vreau să le acoperim în a testa tehnologia de Flutter. Am integrat push notification-ul, am integrat Bluetooth Low Energy-ul, cu toate că nu l-am implementat la nivel de companie, dar ne-am jucat cu niște senzori care foloseau protocolul de Bluetooth Low Energy, mai concret beacon-uri, pentru a vedea dacă există o mașină parcată pe locul respectiv sau nu. Am făcut integrare cu Siri și Google Assistant. Am făcut și atunci am testat inclusiv interoperability-ul și integrarea unei funcționalități, unui codebase nativ într-o aplicație de Flutter. Și atunci ne-am dat seama de cât de mare este diferența de performanță între Flutter și Xamarin sau Flutter și React Native. De exemplu, pe Xamarin am văzut tot timpul, bine, în primul rând la comparația cu Xamarinul este vorba și de acoperirea codebase-ului comun pe partea de UI. Noi personal nu am avut, cred că, nicio aplicație client pe care să o livrăm folosind Xamarin Lite, tocmai pentru că analizând diferite feedback-uri am văzut că nu este neapărat o soluție pe care să mergem, deci aici, din păcate, Silviu, nu te pot ajuta. Dar la partea de cât de ușor se integra un codebase nativ într-o soluție de Flutter, diferența era imensă. Iar dacă compar cu React Native-ul, de multe ori am observat pe React Native, în momentul în care trebuia să se implementeze o funcționalitate nativă, că trecerea, bridge-ul dintre codul nativ și codul de JavaScript de pe React Native era aproape vizibil în UI. Trecerea dintr-o parte în cealaltă dura foarte mult. Dacă faci și un profiling folosind un tool, o să vezi că rezultatele sunt chiar foarte mari. Dar trebuie să recunosc sincer, eu personal pe Xamarin nu am lucrat, deci toate informațiile pe care vi le prezint astăzi nu le bazez neapărat doar pe cunoștințele mele, ci pe ceea ce am reușit ca și echipă să punem jos de-a lungul a peste 11 ani de dezvoltare în echipa de mobile din compania noastră. Și atunci revenim la soluția curentă. Ce și-a dorit clientul? Și-a dorit un singur codebase, cât mai mult cod reutilizabil, atât pe aplicația de mobile phone, cât și pe cele 3 smartwatches. Și variantele la care am ajuns în cele din urmă pentru a putea acoperi nevoile funcționale a fost React Native-ul și Flutter-ul. De ce am decis să alegem Flutter-ul? În primul rând, ceea ce v-am zis anterior, performanța pe zona de Flutter este foarte, foarte bună, aproape comparativ cu Native-ul. Motivul din spatele ei vine din cauza că Flutter-ul are componentele ei de UI, numite widget-uri. Nu mai folosește niciun fel de wrapper peste componentele de UI native și mai mult decât atât vine cu un core engine și un rendering pentru aceste componente de UI. De aici vine și diferența aceasta de performanță în randarea UI-ului. Categoric, asta vine în cele din urmă și cu un back, pentru că acest core engine pe parte de mobile app vine integrat în build propriu zis. Sergiu mă întreabă dacă am folosit Kotlin multiplatform. L-am folosit doar că Kotlin multiplatform la momentul de față, eu sunt personal un mare fan de Kotlin, poate și pentru că background-ul meu cel mai vast este în zona de Android. Și pentru Android development, Kotlin a adus foarte, foarte multe improvement comparativ cu Java. Din păcate, ce regret la partea de Kotlin multiplatform este, din nou, la fel ca și Xamarin-ul, nevoia de a scrie partea de UI diferit în Android, respectiv iOS. Cu toate acestea, Kotlin multiplatform aduce probabil alte beneficii. Dacă deja ai o aplicație de Android, poți să refolosești o mare parte din codebase. Categoric, trebuie să faci anumite ajustări pentru aceasta. Aici mă refer la partea de networking, ca să poți folosi sau să funcționeze și pe partea de iOS. Trebuie să faci niște ajustări, să folosești anumite. Ok, Paul îmi zice că mai am cam 2 minute. Așa că o să mă grăbesc. Poate revin ulterior cu întrebări. Nu știu dacă există și varianta, poate Paul îmi răspunde dacă mai putem răspunde și în offline pe urmă la întrebări. Așa că o să trec un pic să vă prezint ce am definit aici, în această soluție. Am decis să mergem pe tehnologia de Flutter din următoarele motive, pe lângă nevoile cerute de client de single code base. Arhitectura foarte similară cu ce ați văzut anterior. Huawei Watch-ul nu permite instalarea unui standalone app pe device. Aceasta înseamnă că trebuie să avem un companion app care să comunice cu cu ceasul. Dacă mergem pe o soluție de React Native, există posibilitatea aceasta, însă ne expunem la problema de suport de third parties. Florin îmi spune că avem un canal de Slack care va rămâne deschis, deci acolo putem să mai luăm întrebări concrete. Ce ne ajută în zona de Flutter este că putem să refolosim codul de domain și data în aplicația de Huawei. Avem suport pentru asta. Nu există suport în Flutter pentru a crea un target de Apple Watch, însă cu toate acestea noi putem, again, să refolosim partea de domain și data pentru că putem invers să creăm o aplicație nativă de iOS și să refolosim cod de Flutter. Există deja această opțiune. Deja se lucrează și la crearea unui target pentru Apple Watch, dar momentan este doar în beta testing. Dacă vorbim de Samsung Watch, cu toate că Samsung a anunțat că anul acesta, sincer nu știu dacă în ultimele 2 luni nu s-a lansat deja.
S-a lansat.
S-a lansat, super. Samsung Galaxy Samsung Galaxy 4, dacă nu mă înșel, este anul acesta, o să folosească Wear OS. Cu toate ani, majoritatea Samsung Watch-urilor au folosit OS-ul customizat de la Samsung, și anume Tizen OS. Deci aici nu avem nicio soluție și atunci trebuie să implementăm separat o aplicație folosind C++ Technologies. Însă toată partea de refolosire de codebase pentru zona de Huawei și Apple ne permite în bugetul clientului să implementăm și această soluție, pentru că deja am făcut acolo niște optimizări de costuri. Și ăsta a fost motivul pentru care am mers pe Flutter. Acum, un singur minut, dacă mai pot. Ce am mai făcut? Avem deja experiență practică pe 3 proiecte doar în Service Region România, în care deja avem în dezvoltare Single Code-Based Application pentru soluții de Android, iOS și Web Apps, folosind tehnologia de Flutter. Cam așa arată o arhitectură, again, foarte similar, parte de UI separată de parte de domain, separată de parte de networking, cu niște detalii specifice de zonă de Flutter. Din păcate, nu mai apucăm să ne uităm peste Hybrid App-ul, care era o soluție sau singura soluție pe care aș recomanda-o pentru anumite edge case-uri. Dar cine știe, poate mai avem ocazia într-o altă ediție să intrăm mai în detalii.
Mai am eu o scurtă întrebare închisă.
Așa,
Android sau iOS pentru dezvoltare?
Mai ai o întrebare, scuze?
Mă auzi? Da, între Android și iOS. Care e mai ușor? Care e mai plăcut?
Aici, din păcate, nu pot să-ți răspund fără să fiu cumva subiectivă. Background-ul meu, v-am zis, este în zona de Android, deci pentru mine categoric Android o să fie mai ușor decât iOS-ul. Sunt și utilizator de Android constant. Am avut, cred că, un singur an în care chiar am încercat intenționat să lucrez cu un device de iOS, dar cumva toată experiența și eram obișnuită cu feature-uri sau mă așteptam la anumite feature-uri cu care eram familiară, m-a făcut să revin după un an de zile la Android. Cumva ăsta a fost targetul meu de minim un an de zile. Am jonglat în ultimul an jumate cu aplicații de Flutter. Deși nu mi-am propus asta, a fost cumva o nevoie la momentul respectiv în companie și pot să zic că îmi place. Deci chiar încep să devin încet un fan al Flutter-ului, descoper tot mai multe lucruri interesante, deși nu eram deloc un fan a unei soluții cross-platform și colegii mei știu asta. Încep să devin unul. Cu toate acestea știu și am discutat cu mulți colegi și persoane care sunt utilizatori constanți de iOS. Cred că este și vorba de obișnuință și preferințe până la urmă. Ca în orice altceva, preferințele nu se discută. Cred că sunt pros și cons în toate soluțiile. Chiar dacă nu sunt un utilizator și un developer de iOS, trebuie să recunosc că sunt un utilizator și un mare fan de MacBook, comparativ cu Windows. Deci hai să zicem că nu neapărat țin doar cu o zonă sau cealaltă.
Am înțeles. Mersi mult, Alexandra. Alexandra Iacob, așadar, de la Nagaro, despre toată vasta lume a dezvoltării de aplicații pe mobil și nu numai. Mobil înseamnă și ceasul și, într-adevăr, ceasurile au devenit nu doar că foarte inteligente, dar deja cred că adică eu, de când folosesc Apple Watch, apropo, Alexandra, scot tot mai rar telefonul cu iOS din buzunar, pentru că până la urmă despre asta este vorba, sinergie, și pe lângă asta devin și dispozitive medicale tot mai avansate, dar despre asta poate o să facem un subiect amplu la PIC-IT 005. Alexandra, încă o dată îți mulțumesc și acum noi mergem mai departe, că suntem 59 de persoane aici pe Zoom. Da, dacă v-a plăcut această prezentare, scanați acest cod QR pentru un feedback. Merită, Alexandra, pentru că chiar a intrat foarte în detaliu pe subiect și mergem mai departe cu tombola, cu raffle-ul, așa se numește în backstage raffle draw. Hai să-i spunem tombolă, un fel de bingo, dar cu hârtiuțe și extragerea se face random aici pe Zoom. Cred că Florin Asave este la butoane. El este. Haide să începem cu primul premiu, care nu știu ce este. Da, cineva trebuie să dea și share la screen. O să dai eu spotlight pe mine. Așa. Bun. Hai să vedem. Acolo avem numele tuturor înscrișilor. Sunet de tobe. Le vom adăuga în postmontaj. Poți să bate un fotoliu dacă e nevoie. Pick random participant. Hai să vedem. Ca mine, poți spune primul câștigător ce premiu ia? Știm care... Ce... Bun. Hai să vedem. Pachetul Siemens merge. Sper că zic corect. Dăm prima dată Siemens? Bine, prima dată. Hai să vedem cine câștigă premiul de la Siemens. Încercăm să scoatem membrii Angel Hub ca să nu existe vreo suspiciune. Adelina Boga. Florin, Adelina o să fii contactată. Florin.
Da, da.
Așa, haide. Bun,
eram pe mute. Bun,
dacă
da.
cine câștigă e membru Angel Hub sau nu,
Super,
am nevoie
super.
de acest dialog cu tine. Că tu,
Ok,
tu ai
da. Bun, deci avem primul câștigător, da? Acesta
Da,
este
Adelina
un
Boga
random
pentru-
în C#, să știți.
pentru Siemens. Hai să vedem care este următorul premiu. Dăm
Bun,
pe slide.
ok. Ups,
Florina Savei, felicitări. Uite, vezi?
send it me.
Mergem mai
Asta
departe.
nu e pentru că am făcut eu aplicația, de fapt este făcută în colaborare cu Nadia și este un random din C# și poate chiar o să vă arăt și codul sursă să nu ziceți, dar cum se întâmplă, universul de obicei, da, nu știu ce s-a întâmplat. Ok, pentru că Zoom-ul te ia cu numele cu care te
N-ai fost atent la keynote-ul lui James Buck de seară.
Da.
Asta
Ba da,
asta s-a
exact.
întâmplat. Bun, hai să vedem la cine merge premiul Nagaro.
Bun.
Pe al doilea slide avem un Google, cred că este un Google Home Audio și o lampă.
Eu cred că aș vrea totuși să dau un redraw pentru mine, că nu mi se pare...
Da.
nu mi se
Normal,
pare
pe asta
așa,
zicem.
Asta, ok. Bun, avem
Andreea
U. Andreea U a
nu
câștigat.
este membru, nu?
Nu cred.
Bun. Andreea o să fii contactată pentru acest minunat Google Home și sper ca, la fel ca Alexandra, să fii fan Android, ca să meargă tot ecosistemul exemplar. Hai să vedem și următorul premiu, rapid,
Bun.
de la Atos.
Lampa. Avem o lampă inteligentă și random number.
Justin Comărnicianu, felicitări, numărul 35, la fel o să fii contactat. Toate persoanele care câștigă acum vor fi contactate. Hai să mergem cu următorul premiu de la
Raiffeisen.
Raiffeisen Bank. O pereche de căști Sennheiser cu Bluetooth, bravo, HD350.
Bun, și o lampă. Ok, și câștigătorul este
Cine câștigă?
Adrian.
Ariana Andrișan, numărul 17,
Ariana,
felicitări.
da.
Nu știu dacă numărul e relevant sau nu, dar Ariana, ești câștigătoare.
Bun. Și mai avem următorul premiu de la Trimble.
Ok, hai să dăm repede. Andrei Pârfta, Silvania Ton, Masters Brașov.
Bun.
Bun,
Felicitări, Andrei.
O să fii contactat. Bun. De la Accenture, hai să vedem.
Avem
Un
Gazdan.
rucsac și, iată, un Echo Dot și două
Priză Wi-Fi.
priză inteligentă de la TP-Link. Hai că le știu. Priza e super bună.
Super. Andreea, din nou.
Hai să mai facem o extragere, ca să nu dăm...
Ok.
Da, să nu câștigi. Ok. Liviu L, misteriosul L.
Felicitări, Liviu.
Liviu, la fel, o să fii contactat. Bun, de la...
Endava avem un... ok, este foarte util în perioada asta. Un UV Sterilizer Box, UV stuff. Super.
Dacă să-ți sterilizezi telefonul mobil și dacă văd eu bine acel semn de acolo, și încarcă telefonul.
Da, super. Ok. Avem un Laurențiu.
Bun, Laurențiu, la fel, o să fii contactat?
Bun, next one. De la CGK avem...
CGK un rucsac?
Da, și acesta este ultimul.
Hai să vedem cine câștigă.
Este
Pleșa
Alexandru. Super.
Să știi că eu eram Peak IT 004, eu nu sunt membru Agile Hub, deci aș fi fost. Am ratat.
Da. Dar nu că și la mine, ideea e că eu în Zoom sunt redenumit în Florina să avea Agile Hub, dar API-ul de la Zoom îți ia numele cu care intra prima dată și atunci nu prea ai ce să faci.
Am înțeles. Felicitări tuturor câștigătorilor, veți fi contactați sau cred că o parte din voi ați fost deja contactați ca să intrați în posesia premiilor. Aceasta a fost tombola și putem să mergem mai departe acum la ultimul keynote speaker, la Nick D. Wild. Building an audience that serves your career goals. And I'm going to switch to English. O să trec la engleză acum ca să-l prezint pe Nick, care cred că este deja în main room, cred că este pregătit. Nick D. Wild has spent the better part of the past decade working in education technology. Most recently, he ran product marketing at Series E startup Guild Education. And prior to Guild, Nick was the managing partner of an immersive training program called Tradecraft. He has an MBA and a bachelor's a BA from Stanford and writes a newsletter about career strategy called The Jungle Gym. Nick, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Oh, there we go. Okay, that should work. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it works. How are you?
Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm in San Diego at the moment, and so it is 8 in the morning. But it seems like it's probably nighttime for all of you. But super appreciative that you all are having me close out your conference. And let me see if I can just jump to and share my slides. I think. Let's see. Host has disabled screen sharing.
Oh,
maybe you can make me a host.
Let's fix that. Florin, poți să-l faci co-host? Te rog.
Yep, 1 second. Because there's a lot.
There we go. I think that worked.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Do you see some slides? Okay, great. Let me do a little bit of moving around. Okay, cool. Well, so first off, just thank you for letting me close out this conference. I realized that like this topic about building an audience is like kind of funny to come right after talks about hexagonal architecture and MongoDB database patterns. But I also think it's just useful every now and then to like zoom back and think about your career holistically for a moment and figure out sort of why you do what you do in the first place. And so ultimately, like if you're at a conference like this, it means you have some aspiration to develop and advance your career. And so my hope is that talking about audience building sort of gives you a way to actually accelerate those career goals. So before I just jump in, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. That was a great introduction. I'm Nick. Up until about a month ago, I led ambassador marketing at Guild. Also product marketing, did a lot of different things. I actually just recently left the company and went independent, which is a story that ties in pretty well with building an audience that I'll get into at the end. But on evenings and weekends, I write a newsletter called The Jungle Gym that's meant to help you build a more fulfilling career by integrating your work and life. And so that's really been kind of a passion project. It's built sort of a through line through my career as I've jumped from one company to another. And that audience has really allowed me a lot of flexibility to determine what I do next. Prior to Guild, I ran an immersive education program called Tradecraft that helped people break into tech. And we advise sort of, hundreds of people about how to navigate their careers. So that this sort of overlap intersection between building an audience and figuring out sort of your career path is something that I've just spent a lot of time digging into. And so in order to kind of give you a sense of like why does building an audience matter, especially like if you're a builder, right? If you're a talented, skilled person, it may seem like that's kind of a distraction and a waste of time. And so I want to make you sort of a pitch for why I think it's important. And I'll start with just this copywriting, right? And so a long time ago, right, in early 2020, copywriting was sort of billed as this like 6-figure skill set that every marketer needed to learn. At least, so in my profession, marketing, copywriting is this really valued skill set. I almost think of it like, if code tells computers what to do, copy tells humans what to do. And then in last June, like that perception started to crack. And most of you will have heard of GPT-3, but for the small number of you who haven't, it's a language prediction algorithm. You can feed it 2/3 of a blog post from your favorite writer, and it can spit out the last part without you even realizing you're reading something that an AI wrote. And so almost as soon as it was released, beta users started publishing text that was almost like indistinguishable from human writing. Users started launching tools to auto-generate marketing copy. And so while copywriting hasn't been fully commodified yet, it's unlikely to stay a 6-figure salary for long. And I think copywriting is not the only skill that's at risk of commodification. So by 2022, like 90% of large companies will have adopted some kind of automation technology. These tools will eventually sort of commodify skills across every profession. And if you think they aren't sort of coming for yours, I think that tends to be dreaming. Like I think it tends to be the more highly paid and valuable somebody is, the more there is an incentive for entrepreneurs to try to build and deploy software that can actually commodify certain skill sets. And so, I think over time that's sort of that's a trend that will just sort of continue to happen. So I think, in the face of this change, where like no single skill set at least is necessarily safe. You can always sort of, keep pushing your learning. And I think that's a really valuable skill. But I think there's other ways that you can kind of fortify your career for the long term without sort of feeling like you're on this skill treadmill. And so what you're really looking for is some sort of career moat, right? And you can kind of think of a career moat as like a professional advantage that protects your long-term employment prospects. This term comes from a writer I really like named Cedric Chin. And so he viewed career moats as what gives you job security, not for your current job, but for your ability to get one in the future. But the thing is, career moats really aren't what they used to be, right? In this, there's a book that I really like called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And the author Cal Newport suggests the best way to build a career moat is to build this portfolio of rare and valuable skills, right? And that was really good advice in the pre-automation era, right? But it begs the question, just like we discussed before, which skills are actually resilient to commodification? If a skill is both rare and valuable, it should follow there's like a really strong incentive for entrepreneurs to try to automate it with software. And accordingly, like a strong incentive for companies to actually adopt that software. So look, I've spent my career in talent development. I think there's an extraordinary amount of value in building new skills, but I think it's much harder to find skills that offer long-term career security. So to protect your career prospects in the decades ahead, you need something that's hard for machines to replicate. So an area where I believe humans will retain our edge for a long time is our ability to influence one another. While machines can find ways to entertain, to inform us, humans are sort of just evolutionarily predisposed to take cues about what products to buy, what politicians to vote for, what companies to work for from other members of our species. And so given the economic value that comes from those choices, our ability to influence one another probably remains like a suitable advantage for at least the foreseeable future. And so to put simply, like I think building an audience is a really good strategy for anybody who wants to build a resilient career. Beyond just like downside protection, I also think an engaged audience can help with a lot of other elements of your career. If you want to eventually fundraise for a company idea, job searching, recruiting, winning customers, making friends, generating new ideas. I recently left my job about a month ago, And because I have, you know, a newsletter with a pretty modest audience, right? Like 4,000 isn't a crazy audience to have, right? Like I know people who have, you know, a 10x that, right? But just that alone made it so there was just this steady stream of opportunities that gave me this just really easy way to kind of offboard from a single company to something that was a more dynamic career that I was excited about. And so you know, there's a phrase, at least an American phrase, that people talk about having fuck you money. I think the same thing can be true with an audience, right? You can have a fuck you audience that can allow you a lot more ability to be able to decide the course of your career. So before I jump in, I just want to say, like, there are all sorts of ways to think about building an audience and writing, right? Like I you know, you can write for passion, you can write for profit. I'm talking specifically about writing for advancement. And so like, you know, for those of you who think about writing as a passion or think about writing as a you know, way to make money, I think those things are totally fine. This is just sort of the specific type of kind of audience building that I'm talking about. Okay, so just to kick things off, like, if you think about the following sentence, to become a blank, I need to build an audience of blank so that I can blank, right? And so a lot of people who are you know, new to building an audience, like, don't find this sentence very easy to complete. In particular, they kind of get hung up on like the first bit, which is like defining professional goals. And I understand that, because setting career goals is really daunting. And it can feel like very out of place when you're just sort of thinking about building an audience for the first time, but it's actually pretty worthwhile. And so the risk of like skipping this step, which a lot of people do, is you miss out on like, what is this optimal audience that you should build? And so instead of spending your time in a way that like that enhances your career, you end up doing things that are distracting from it. So just to give you a sense of how the sentence might change depending on your career objectives, here's how like an aspiring seed startup investor might fill this out, right? In order to become a seed stage investor, I need to build an audience of fintech founders so I can generate enough deal flow to attract investment from LPs. An up and coming executive might say, to become a senior executive of my company, I need to build an audience of junior talent so I can prove to my CEO that I'm a capable talent attractor. An independent consultant might say, to become an independent marketing consultant, I need to build an audience of senior marketers so I can generate inbound leads for my practice, right? And so that's just kind of the way you might think about it. And you're trying to sort of project, I think, a few years ahead, right? It's always hard to say, like, what do I want to be in 10 years? Like, everything's moving very fast. But if you think sort of 2 career jumps out, you're probably in a good spot to be thinking about what kind of audience to build. So let's talk about kind of how you figure out that like first little part, which is your career goals. I think figuring out career goals is really hard. I always sort of think about time as your most precious resource. So whenever I think about like what a good life is, it's kind of being able to spend your time in ways that bring you energy. And so the exercise that I coach people to try is like, imagine a week in your life, like 5 years from today, right? You don't pick some special week where you're on vacation, just like a normal week. And then you like try to like create your calendar, right? Like literally you like open up a new calendar in Google Calendar and you actually start building it out for yourself. And then when you show your current calendar versus your ideal calendar, you'll notice like there's different ways that you're spending time, right? Like who are you spending time with? What locations? What activities are you doing? And that can kind of give you a sense for what kind of career paths make a lot of sense and which ones don't. And so then your question is like, what would it take to make this vision a reality, right? How much would it cost, right? So if you think about like, if like being in an inexpensive location supports that, right? That can kind of give you a sense for what kind of career paths make a lot of sense. Are you in a more expensive city? Are you in a considerably nicer house? If so, then earning a lot of money could be part of those goals, right? What work activities are on your ideal calendar? Do they resemble the ones that are in your current job? And then finally, like, who do you want to spend time with? Do you want to be spending lots of time with your coworkers? Do you want to be spending lots of time alone, hacking on problems? Do you want to spend time with friends and family? Right? All those things are kind of useful to think through. And so now you can start actually like figuring out like, okay, which career paths actually match your aspirational lifestyle. And it's totally okay just if you can't settle on just one. The point is actually to ensure that like whatever audience you build allows you to pursue any career paths that sound enticing. And so, this isn't the only way to figure out your career goals, but it's something that I think you can do to like quickly get started, because honestly, like figuring out what you want to do takes a long time. And so this is sort of just a good way to like make sure, hey, like of the things that I might want to do, I'm not sort of building an audience that would go counter to those things. So with those goals in mind, right, then it's a little bit easier about who you should be targeting with your audience building efforts. And so as a thought exercise, there's a few questions I like to consider, right? One is like, who are the gatekeepers that will end up determining whether you succeed or not, right? And so no matter what you want to do with your career, you'll need to like win over somebody to get resources and legitimacy to get what you need. And so an aspiring author might need to impress literary agents, book publishers, and magazine editors. A startup founder may need investors, customers, potential co-founders. So whoever those gatekeepers are for you, like those are the people that you may want to build an audience of. And so then there's another way to think about it. Like rather than just thinking straight like about the specific gatekeepers and building an audience of them, the question is, what kind of audience would legitimize you in their eyes? So one option is to sort of write directly for your future gatekeepers, but instead you could actually find an audience that your gatekeepers will find impressive. And so, for example, like the aspiring author may want to build an audience of likely readers to make the case to publishers that you should be taken seriously. The future founder may want to build an audience of potential buyers to impress future investors. And then the last way to think about it is like, what kind of audience does your future employer need to reach? So you can build an audience that will directly benefit the type of companies you aspire to join. So for example, like if you have an audience filled with potential customers and employees for your dream company, it's much easier to make the case that they should hire you. So once you have this hypothesis of who you need to engage, then it's time to sort of just dig in and learn about your audience. And so you can do this through direct interviews, subject matter, conversation with subject matter experts, researching the things that they're reading, joining communities and listening in on conversations. And what you're doing is like, you're trying to discover their needs, but you're also sort of building out like a persona to complete with. You're trying to understand, who are they in terms of demographics, right? Like what's their career history and ambition? What are their goals and interests? What are their media consumption habits? Who influences them? What are these challenges and pain points? And this is going to give you clues about how you can create value for your audience. So now that you have like a better understanding of this audience, it's time to build out this engagement vehicle. And that could be a podcast, a newsletter, a community. It could be you on Twitter. It could be a blog, right? Whatever you think will create real value for your audience in a way that aligns with your abilities. So if that could be writing, it could be doing a podcast, right? Like, so there are all sorts of things. To make sure you've like picked the right type of engagement vehicle, there's a few questions you may answer, right? What topics are you knowledgeable about that you plan to continue studying? What skills are you good at that you plan to continue improving? What information streams you have access to that other people don't? What uncommon experiences are in your past that may end up persisting into your future? And so this is really your opportunity to be expansive, right? If you love to write, start a newsletter or blog. If you're great at speaking, start a podcast or event series. And so there's a whole lot of different ways that you can engage an audience. And so it's worth kind of really figuring out which one is a really good match for both your audience and for your skill set. And if you're feeling like imposter syndrome, this is a quote I've always liked. This guy's the Dilbert cartoonist, Scott Adams. And he suggests that like, you don't actually need to be a world leading expert on a topic or to master a certain skill in order to leverage it. Instead, you just pick two things that you're top 25% at and find the intersection. So I'll read the quote really quick, which I think is a good one. Everyone has at least a few areas in which they could be top 25% with some effort. In my case, I can draw better than most people, but I'm hardly an artist. And I'm not any funnier than your average stand-up comedian who makes it big, but I'm funnier than most people. Magic is that few people can draw well and write jokes. It's the combination of the two that makes what I do so rare. So I think finding those combinations, it can be really special. So for example, Someone who spent years as an executive recruiter might have top 25% knowledge about the hiring process and comp negotiation. If you also happen to be a top 25% speaker, you could easily create a great podcast about job hunting senior executives. So these are the kind of things where, like, if you find that kind of special intersection, you can find a great place to spend your time. So now, like, let's just revisit this sort of mission sentence that we've talked about for our startup founder. And I'm going to add kind of a to the original positioning statement, a second statement. So to become a seed stage investor, I need to build out an audience of fintech founders so I can generate enough deal flow to attract investment from my LPs. I plan to engage this audience by filling their need for camaraderie and market insight by creating an exclusive community for promising fintech leaders. Let's go back to the upcoming senior executive. To become a senior executive of my company, I need to build an audience of junior talent so I can prove to my CEO that I'm capable of attracting talent. I plan to engage this audience by filling their need for career advice by creating a newsletter where I give advice about common career dilemmas faced by junior talent. Independent consultant. To become an independent consultant, I need to build an audience of senior marketers so I can generate inbound leads for my practice. I plan to engage this audience by filling their need for fresh marketing insight by building an aggregated collection of marketing case studies from my network of other independent consultants. So again, you can fill this in for you, but what it's really saying is, like, you want to add to this positioning statement what kind of engagement vehicle you're going to build, and what pain it's actually solving for people. So now you figured out how to position what you're building for an audience that aligns with your career goals, and what you have now is a pretty solid hypothesis for your niche. And this is where kind of the hard part comes in, right? So whether you're starting a newsletter, an online course, an in-person event series, it's time to, like, put in the work and start building. So the playbook for growing blog readership is different for growing a community, but these are sort of some principles that apply no matter, like, what kind of engagement vehicle you're trying to build. So the first is, like, start with your inner circle. The first members of your audience will likely be your friends and family. And so just, like, ask them to be patient as you figure out what you're doing. Keep up a regular cadence, ask for lots of feedback, pay special attention to anyone who's like a really close match with your target audience. Like, your audience may not be much overlap with your friends and family, but you probably have at least a few people there. Ask for referrals, right? So once you're getting consistently good feedback, send personalized messages to engaged members of your audience, asking if they'd be willing to refer a friend or colleague who might be interested. And if the referrals start coming, that's like a sign that you're ready to pursue the type of audience that you wanted to collect in the first place. Then you want to kind of, now you're sort of ready to go beyond your first network and those referrals, which is, like, find out where your audience is hanging out, right? Are they talking to each other on Twitter? Are they posting in some obscure subreddit or Slack community? Wherever they are, just sort of find your way into that conversation. And once you're there, start adding value, right? So before you start advertising what you're working on, try generating some goodwill, right? And as you build up social capital, you'll find openings to share what you're building and invite others to join. And then you really want to retain them, right? So give them some taste of value, and in exchange, ask for some sort of personal information that will give you a direct way to communicate with them. So that could be an email, that could be a phone number. You just want some way to communicate with them outside of the platform where you originally found them. And then when you release a new blog post or podcast episode or video, get comfortable, like, sharing it widely. And you'll also have a lot more success if you share it in ways that feel native to each channel. So for example, writing a blog post, like, if you're sharing that on Twitter, sharing that through a tweet thread or something like that can be a really good way to, like, make it feel native to the platform. And then if you deliver consistent value, eventually referrals will come. So ultimately, like, people will end up giving you their attention and their time. And that's sort of, for my newsletter, that's what happened, where, like, it took, post after post, kind of keeping it top of mind each time that, like, hey, if you're getting value out of this and you want to refer somebody, that would be great. And that's been a really powerful growth engine for me, at least. So anyway, like, I think you can really do all of the, you can write for passion, you can write for profit, you can write for advancement, any way that you really want to do this, that's totally fine. I did it in my own way, and I think you can find yours as well. But in general, I would just advise anyone who's kind of curious about building an audience. It is really empowering to be able to have kind of direct communication with a group of people who want to hear from you, and I think it can be a really big, powerful accelerant to your career. So, all right, that's my talk, and I'm happy to answer questions that pop up. Unfortunately, I speak very poor Romanian, but I feel like all of you speak, fortunately, much better English. So, and if you want to, there's more kind of career advice, audience building stuff on the Jungle Gyms. That's just junglegym.substack.com. And then if you want to ask me any questions that you don't want to ask in public, you can just find me on Twitter at Nick DeWilde, and my DMs are open. All right, cool.
So I have a question for you.
Please.
If your work talks for itself, make people talk, especially in your community or in your work field, how do you keep them, or how do you attract them to follow you, to be in your audience?
You're saying if your work speaks for itself, how do you build an audience?
Yeah.
I mean, I think when it comes to attract, like, people are generally pretty, people do things that are in their interest, right? So people make decisions about who to follow, who to spend their scarce attention and time on, by like who they think will help them advance in their life, right? And so I always think about, like, if you can do work, right, that helps other people succeed at their goals, then like you're in a much easier spot to get people to follow you. So let's say you're a developer, right? Like if you want to build an audience of other developers who maybe want to get good at something you're already good at, right? You sort of want to adopt a teaching mindset, because if you're teaching people about something that they want to learn, like, you're helping them accomplish their goals, and thus they'll be really incentivized to follow you. I think a lot of people end up sort of publishing content that is really suited to what they want to talk about, but really it's much more starting from an audience mindset and understanding, hey, what are the people who might follow you want to hear, and what will keep them sort of tuned in and hooked. Like, for those of you who've been kind of obsessed with Web3 or cryptocurrency, which I've certainly been going down that rabbit hole lately. What you'll notice is like the people that you can follow, right? Like they're sort of they're essentially dropping financial advice, right? And so you almost have to follow them in order to make good decisions. And so that's a really powerful carrot to get someone to follow you. But you can do that in lots of different domains.
A good question from Andrea Peter. How can you go global if you already conquered the local audience?
I think going global, I mean, to some degree, it's I wouldn't necessarily assume that that the global audience needs the same thing as the local audience. I would probably sort of figure out, I'd kind of look at my audience and say, hey, it's probably not totally local. There's probably some people kind of trickling in from like a next circle out. And I would find those people, kind of find what they're engaging with. And that's kind of the thing that you want to dig into next. So like, I have a fair number of readers from India. And so those folks, they tend to like, whereas my US audience kind of likes content about sort of balancing work and life, I think my Indian audience tends to like content about like really practical skill sets that sort of get you ahead and advancing in your career. And so if I was trying to sort of grow in that next market, I would focus on that. And I'd also see like, hey, like, that probably also ends up attracting people from a few other countries as well, right? And so I think it's you want to do something ideal for a single person versus trying to do something that's sort of like general catch-all for everybody. So I think kind of pinpointing a next audience that feels likely to kind of grow in and get referrals in is a good way to go.
A good question from Camelia, and I'm a little bit biased. There is a saying that nobody is preacher at home. Is it wise to start with outer audience before starting with the inner circle?
I think it's good to start with your inner circle, mostly because like they'll be supportive of you, right? And I think what you ultimately want is like when you start out, you want people who are supportive, but also like, again, if you're intentionally making sure that you're giving them tons of value, then like you should feel good about building that audience, and you should feel good about building those relationships with them. And so I think it's a great place to start focusing on folks at home.
And also test your content. What tips do you have for finding your unique value proposition to stand out in a crowd of similar products? From Paul.
Yeah, I go back to that quote by I'll actually stop sharing here. I go back to that Scott Adams quote, which I think is a really good one, which is all about finding this sort of like overlap, like right, your Venn diagram between the thing that you're top 25% at and the other thing you're top 25% at.
Yes.
And so I think like finding this thing, right, that we're like, if you are spending a ton of time learning something, it probably means that like you're in the top 25% of the cutting edge. And if there's like a skill set that you're good at, right, that's the same thing. I don't think you have to wait till you're an expert to create content. I think this kind of creating content as you learn is a really good way to learn, and it's also a good way to sort of there's a idea of building in public, right, where you're sort of building whatever product that you're building as you go, and you're talking about it publicly. I think the same thing is true when you're learning something.
I think that's it. I think that was the last. I think that was the last one. You said that your audience is divided, USA and India. Do you write two types of articles, or do you try to find content for each specific one?
So I would say my audience actually has gotten pretty global at this point, but India definitely has a concentration just because there's a lot of people in India, and who I think tend to like career advice. I tend to I think over time I've been doing this. I've been writing since 2013. I sort of had the newsletter since 2019, and I think I found the kind of things that, like at this point, right, there tends to be a crossover, right? At the beginning, you start by writing things that you think are going to be really valuable for your audience. Mm-hmm. And while you're doing that, you kind of find your voice in the things that you like to talk about, and they start to subscribe to you and your perspective and viewpoint. I think I now have like a relatively good sense of like, I'm kind of in tune with what the general whole audience finds valuable. And so I tend to do stuff that I think will kind of hit the full group, but that took time. And so I think in the beginning, you're really focused on, hey, let me find, a couple personas that are my ideal audience member to connect with and write things for them. But I think over time, you'll sort of figure out like, hey, what's an article that feels sort of native to you.
Yeah, I think that was the last one. Oh, no, we have one more. You've recently decided to quit your job and start independently. When it is a good time to start or to think about that?
It's a great question. So about a month ago, I decided to quote unquote go independent. And ultimately, like it was something I've been thinking about for a while. I think, I have a 4-month-old baby. So it was definitely like not an easy decision. I think it would have been certainly easier before we had a kid. I got lucky where a few sort of financial things kind of broke my way, but there was something about having an audience. What it does is it's sort of this like vehicle for good things to come into your life. If you're writing and you're sharing your work publicly, it tends to be that just like good opportunities kind of come into your inbox or into your Twitter DMs. And so I tend to like, but I started the newsletter while I still had a full-time job. And that was I think a useful thing, because it made sure that like, now that I'm sort of going independent, I feel much more confident to do that, because the audience is already sort of built up, right? Sure, could go away tomorrow, but at least, you know, I feel like I've had a couple of years, I sort of understand it. And so I by doing that on the side, it's been helpful sort of making this transition to independence. And so when it comes to sort of audience building and going independent, I think it's good to like, you know, whether it's kind of earning your passive income as like a you know, nights and weekends side project, or it's building your audience as a nights and weekend side project. I think that's useful to do, so you sort of hit some tipping point where you know you'll be able to kind of float on your own for a good period of time.
Another question from Narcisa Lazaroiu, just like a bullet recommendation for tools and channels to recommend to be used for building that audience. So you said podcasts.
I think, you know, it's there are all sorts of tools and channels you could use, right? So you could do something on YouTube, you could do a podcast, you could do a blog, you could do a newsletter, you could do Twitter, you could do Clubhouse, you could do there's kind of there's a bunch of sort of like channels where you could build that audience. I think the ones like I think if you don't have an email address from somebody, or you don't have hold on one second, turn this light off. I think if you don't have an email address, if you don't have a phone number, if you don't have any way you can contact them outside the platform, you're just sort of renting your audience. So building an audience purely on Twitter, I'm always trying to take my audience off of Twitter, because I know that at any point, you know, Twitter could suddenly shadow ban me so that my tweets are only reaching 1% of my audience, right? There's all sorts of things that a platform can do to be able to mediate that relationship. And so I think as much as possible, you want to build an email list. And so that's why I like a newsletter. I think podcasts are great. Like the advantages are you can, you know, go talk to any smart person you want and invite them on your podcast. And like it's a great way to build relationships. But there's pluses and minuses to each. I think what you want to think about is like, you're sort of thinking rather than just you first, right? Thinking of your audience first. So what does your audience actually want? What do they need? What would create value for them? And how do they like to consume content?
And what's with this newsletter thing? I've seen like 3 or 4 journalists from Romania, from like, I don't know, some of them writing on ITNC, some of them on about cars. And they've decided to not focus so much on their personal websites or blogs, and instead they go newsletter. What's special about it?
Well, with a newsletter versus with a blog, you're writing every time you publish something, you have to promote it to new people, or you have to hope that Google search engines pick it up. Now, I don't like writing for Google. I like writing for human beings. And so to me, a newsletter works because I know that it's gonna hit people's inboxes. Now, there's, you know, email deliverability is an issue, right? There's no perfect channel, or else everybody would use it. But I think newsletters tend to be good because you have this portable audience, right? If you when you build that email list, you can actually take that with you to a different platform. So ultimately, it's more your audience when it's on a newsletter than it is the platform's audience. And I think that's a really important thing. I think when it comes to journalists, I mean, in the US, you're seeing all sorts of people leaving, you know, the New York Times and moving to Substack. And ultimately, it can just make a lot more money. It turns out that like there's a small number of journalists who are making it so that these newspapers are viable, and if they go off on their own, they can pretty easily earn, you know, $5 a month from their subscribers. And so a lot of journalists are realizing that's a much better deal, where they can kind of write about what they want and not have to deal with the bad economics of being part of a newsletter bundle or a newspaper bundle.
How do you reconcile the 2-second attention span people currently have and articles?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be like capturing attention is that's the name of the game, right? Attention is the scarce resource right now, and the ways to capture attention, like there are tricks you can use to capture attention, right? There's you can have a hook that's provocative, right, and makes people want to keep reading, right? Like, I lost $1 million last year. Here's what I learned, right? Like, yeah, you want to read that, right? But really underneath that there is some goal that your audience has in their life that they are sort of passively looking for a solution for. And when you think about your content, does it help your audience solve those goals? Does it help them kind of figure out those things? And if it does, that's kind of the way to capture attention. Can you do something interesting that really helps someone do something? And so I think sort of thinking about your content as a product in and of itself that solves problems is one of the best ways to make sure you're maintaining attention.
And also hopping on newer platforms, it works. Like TikTok is exploding right now. And we're seeing this while certain big YouTube names, they start to lose relevance. Can also this become a tool?
Sure. I mean, I think it's always a good idea to experiment with new platforms, right? Like you can end up becoming the suggested person or moving up, catching a wave as it's like cresting is always a nice move. And so it's always good to experiment with those things. I think ultimately you need something that's kind of native to your audience and native to you. But like, it's never a bad idea to like experiment and kind of have fun with new platforms.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great answers, great speech. Thank you very much for your time. That was Nick DeWild. Acesta a fost Nick DeWild, building an audience that serves your career goals. Ponturi interesante despre cum să ai grijă de cariera ta și să devii o personalitate în domeniul în care tu lucrezi. Nick, thank you again so much for your time and enjoy San Diego. I hope the weather is good there.
Thank you guys, appreciate it.
Dacă v-a plăcut ceea ce ați văzut, scanați codul QR ca să lăsați un feedback. Avem toate feedback-urile strânse și de ieri și de astăzi și până acum numai note foarte bune. Acesta a fost Peak IT ediția cu numărul 4. Mulțumim tare mult că ne-ați urmărit, că ați ascultat tot ceea ce speakerii au avut de spus, prezentările tehnice, atelierele și sperăm că după cele 2 zile pline ați plecat cu mai multe cunoștințe acasă. Eu am fost Marian Andrei de la Brașov, am venit special aici și am amenajat un studio foarte drăguț aici la Katia și gata, m-am emoționat moment, trebuie să vă spun la revedere și mulțumim încă o dată.